Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman
and Jonathan Lack.
And we are here to step into the Grand Tour, the Grand Tour, the Grand Tour. That's right, we are stepping once more into the Grand Tour of anime this week on the show. We are closing out our little trilogy of Tezuka Osamu-related episodes that began with Dororo and continued with Dororo. But this week, we're finishing it with something a little bit different in more ways than one, because we're concluding our trilogy with the trilogy itself. We are today discussing one of the more peculiar pieces of anime we have yet to look at on this podcast, which is the Animerama Trilogy of movies made by Mushi Productions in the late 60s and early 70s, which is a trilogy of erotic animated films. We are today talking about 1001 Nights, Cleopatra, and Belladonna of Sadness.
Indeed we are. And you say one of the most peculiar things we've covered. Sean, this is the most unusual thing we've covered so far on this podcast. Is that correct? Or am I forgetting something?
I think that's probably fair, outside of, like, I don't know, we did that one Christmas episode where you made me read Gundam Wing fan fiction. You know, that's so if we're going in, like, the weird corners of random bullshit we've done, there's stuff like that. But in terms of, like, an officially released proper product we are, like, reviewing on the podcast, I think this is it.
And you know what? None of that Gundam fan fiction was as hardcore as some of the stuff in these movies. So,
it's true.
You know, we've got some interesting stuff to talk about today. So yes, what are we talking about today? It is these 3 films created by Mushi Productions. 3 of the last things created by Mushi Productions, distributed by Nippon Herald Films, all aimed at an adult audience and including erotic elements, although I think you could debate whether or not you would call these erotic films. It very much depends. And they are all directed by Yamamoto Eiichi, and those are 1001 Nights, Cleopatra, and Belladonna of Sadness, as Sean just said. The term Animerama is a portmanteau, meaning one or all of animation plus drama, animation plus cinerama, which is a term for widescreen, although not the kind of widescreen these movies use.
Yes.
Animation plus panorama, or animation, drama, and cinerama. Different people have given different accounts for each of those. Tezuka participated closely in the first 2 movies. He did not participate in Belladonna of Sadness, and that one was marketed at the time as an anime Romanesque, perhaps in part because it is the only one of the 3 that is not in widescreen and therefore not panoramic or cineramic. But in any case, they are now known as the Animerama Trilogy. While 1001 Nights was a hit, both Cleopatra and Belladonna were commercial failures, and these 3 films are among the final works of the original Mushi Pro incarnation, which went bankrupt in 1973, more or less at the same time as Belladonna of Sadness. You will see it said online, like English Wikipedia says this, and it's wrong, that Belladonna of Sadness drove them to bankruptcy. That's patently false. They were in the shitter before they made any of these movies. They were in the shitter at the time of Dororo. It was rough, and the release of Belladonna and the bankruptcy proceedings were happening more or less at the same time.
Yes, yeah, it is apocryphal to say that it caused it, but obviously, yes, it is the product of a dying studio. And it is funny to call these things a trilogy, because Belladonna of Sadness is nothing like the first 2. 1001 Nights and Cleopatra, I think those movies are qualitatively quite different, but are of the same ilk, the same kind of movie. Belladonna of Sadness is a whole different beast. But yes, these are three really fascinating, very strange films that come from such an early period in anime history that they don't really resemble what you would consider, I think, anime today for different reasons for some of the different movies, like Belladonna for different reasons than 1001 Nights and Cleopatra, but they all have a very different animation style and taste to what you think of as anime, generally speaking, of Japanimation. And they then also, in terms of that genre, they are, so of the time of Japanese cinema, of incorporating these various kinds of erotic elements, that they are really unique and very fascinating. Though while I liked 1001 Nights and I really like Belladonna of Sadness, I do not think Cleopatra is particularly a good movie, but they are all very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, let's do that really quickly, our quick hits on the movies. I would say 1001 Nights and Cleopatra are both extremely episodic, very overlong, and kind of hit or miss. But I think 1001 Nights leans towards hits, and so I overall like it. And I think Cleopatra leans towards misses, although I will say I think Cleopatra has sequences that are big hits, and I think 1001 Nights has sequences that are big misses. So they are both mixed bags, but I would say one leans hits, one leans misses. And then I think Belladonna of Sadness is like one of the most remarkable things ever produced in the Japanese animation industry and is really, really worth talking about.
Yes, and I generally would agree with that. I think for me, my big picture take on 1001 Nights and Cleopatra is that both of them are very episodic. They're kind of meandering, anarchic films in terms of their structure. I think the key difference between them is that 1001 Nights' mythological sort of stylings lean into an anarchic, formless, meandering plot style, and the sort of political fiction history thing of Cleopatra does not lean into a long meandering formless plot style. And so I actually think 1001 Nights is one of the more interesting representations of mythological style storytelling I've seen in film, which is a mode of storytelling that is not really sort of conducive to cinema. Like, they're just like of such different styles. It's much more televisual or episodic is what you'd think of if you wanted to adapt mythology. So I think 1001 Nights is actually quite interesting movie in that regard. Cleopatra, though, the source material it's trying to pull from just does not match with that at all. And it also has, I think, if you're interested in the history of Cleopatra, it's got maybe the worst take on Cleopatra I've seen in a piece of fiction. Like, it's such a boring, passive, fairly sexist depiction of her. That is also a disappointment about that film.
Yes. But what did you think of Belladonna specifically?
Oh, Belladonna, it's fascinating. Yeah, I think it's like, obviously stylistically, it is incredibly masterful and so unique and just such a gorgeous film. I also am very interested in the subject matter. Like, I like that kind of story of pulling that sort of looking at Satanism and witchcraft as this thing that represents the oppressed peoples of the medieval period, but more specifically like the early modern historical period, which is when like you have your witch trials and stuff like that is more early modern history. And I think looking at that and how the sort of like underground and rebellious aspects of Satanism and witchcraft, as opposed to the sort of godly but destructive and overwhelming order, the class system and stuff like that. That's just such a great sort of theme, and the movie explores that with such an overwhelming sense of style. I think is really awesome.
Absolutely. And and all of these definitely we're going to talk about coincide with the Japanese New Wave, but I think Belladonna is the one that is most clearly that should just be in the canon of Japanese New Wave films, because it is also exactly what you're saying about its politics is what the other filmmakers like Yoshide and Oshima were doing with like looking at history to try to understand current politics. A lot of them were looking specifically at Japanese history, but this is still very much in line with that. So yeah, I think we agree. And, even Cleopatra being, I think, a not so good film is a super interesting movie. Like, it's worth talking about. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, all three of these movies are out from Discotheque, we should just say, in the United States. And you can get them on Blu-ray. To be clear, 1001 Nights and Cleopatra are not Blu-ray sources. You can tell when you watch them. Those are DVDs that have been upscaled. And they are on Blu-ray because Discotheque releases Blu-rays. They don't do DVDs anymore. Those are DVD masters. Belladonna of Sadness has had one of the most lush 4K restorations you will ever see in animation, and it looks, like on a picture quality level, that is probably the best thing Discotheque has ever released, and it's incredible. So definitely worth owning for that reason. And of course, you get the audio tracks and you get them properly subtitled and all that, so it is nice to have the history represented there.
Yes, yeah, and definitely I think Belladonna of Sadness is a movie worth owning, for sure.
Yes. All right, so let's go ahead. Sean, do you want to go ahead and jump into the history of all of this?
Yes, I have never been more relieved, Jonathan, to not be the person responsible for the history research for a podcast, because this is one of yours. So go ahead and take it away, Jonathan. What are we looking at here?
We are looking at the longest history document I've ever put together for this podcast. So it definitely is in contention with some of your crazier KyoAni ones for one of our longest documents, but we'll do our best here. So the history of these movies is that near the end of 1966, so this is a few years before Dororo, which we talked about, but in the middle of, so Astro Boy has been on TV for 3 years, so they're in the middle of kind of their TV boom. And Tezuka is approached by a company called Nippon Herald Films about potentially creating original work. Nippon Herald had been founded under a different name in the 50s, and in 1961 merged with a company called the Nippon Cinema Corporation, a company founded in 1948, to distribute American films after the war. So American films had been barred from Japan for a long time. With the occupation, they were allowed to come back in, and so companies kind of sprung up to do that. Nippon Herald primarily distributed imported films, and continued to do it for long after these movies we're talking about today. For example, in 1992, they distributed Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, the David Lynch film, in its very successful Japanese run, the only country where that movie was successful. So after talking it over with Yamamoto Eiichi and Sugi Gizaburo, who we've both talked about before, Tezuka and Nippon Herald decided to push the envelope and create original films that would be more adult and erotic in nature, in line with global cinema trends and the kinds of sort of, for lack of a better term, hip modern movies that Nippon Herald themselves were distributing. And at this point, we have to pause for a long digression, but it is important, on why did the guy who made Mighty Atom want to make adult erotic material, and why did this company come to them for it? So here we have to talk about two intersecting trends that set the stage. The rise of pink films in the Japanese industry and the Japanese New Wave. And for this section, just so y'all know, I am drawing mainly from the Kitaura Hiroyuki essay, The Studio System, in a book called The Japanese Cinema Book, and David Desser's 1988 monograph, Eros Plus Massacre, which remains the best English language book on the Japanese New Wave, if you're interested. That is actually one of my favorite academic texts I think I've ever read. It's very good. So Japan had, going into the 60s, one of the world's most powerful and durable studio systems. Very much akin to Hollywood in terms of kind of its structure and the way you had very identifiable different studios. And this was true both before and after the war. The 1950s saw the rise of Toei as the foremost commercial force and the expansion of Japanese film worldwide following Rashomon's Golden Lion win at Venice in 1951. So the 50s were an enormous decade for cinema. Most of the most famous live-action Japanese movies that Westerners have seen come out in the 1950s, a lot of them in 1954, which is when we got Godzilla and Seven Samurai and Sancho the Bailiff and many more. During the 50s, domestic audiences increased year over year, and a Japanese citizen would visit the cinema at least once a month on average during this golden age, which is a crazy stat. If you consider the whole population on average was going at least once a month, that is a lot of movie viewing. Toei, which we've talked about before as they got into animation this decade, that's because they were the main force in the 50s. They were very much at the vanguard. They were the most kind of with the trends of the time, and they massively expanded their production output. Remember that Japanese studios owned their own theaters. There is no equivalent in Japan to the Paramount Decree, the U.S. Supreme Court decision that forced American studios to divest from theater ownership and created a tradition mostly still in place, although that decision was overturned by the Roberts Court, that theaters are different companies than distributors. So part of Toei's motivation in expanding their output of films was to book their theaters with their product and their product only, and it worked. They went from, and this is just an incredible stat, 42 cinemas in December 1953 to 155 in August 1954. Shochiku, Daiei, Toho, Nikatsu, the other big five, all scaled up production in response to Toei. Every company was generally releasing 2 new films per week, and costs ballooned. Most studios were not able to keep up with that insanely ballooning bubble they were in. By 1957, Toei had 837 exclusive cinemas, surpassing the sum of the other 4 studios combined. And Toei and the other studios were investing heavily in technologies like widescreen production, specifically CinemaScope 235:1, and color technology. They built their screens around this. They weren't adapting existing screens. They were building big CinemaScope theaters. And so most movies at these studios had to be shot in CinemaScope. That was a non-negotiable for directors, which is part of why Japan has the best widescreen movies in cinema history, because their directors had to get good at it, and they got very, very good at it. But that also meant that production costs were rising at a time of a massive production boom, because widescreen is not cheap, color is not cheap, and by relying on mass production of films during a period of rising costs, the essay I am quoting here says, the studios may very well have been tying the nooses around their own necks. The 1960s were a period of massive economic growth in Japan, where income more than doubled for average households, consumption of leisure activities booms. But while you would think, oh, that sounds good, they've got more money for movies, it was not good for movies, because in 1959, sales of TV sets exploded. This was around the wedding parade of the Crown Prince Akihito, who would be the future Heisei Emperor, and Princess Michiko, kind of like how TVs exploded for Queen Elizabeth's coronation in the UK. It was the same kind of idea here. TV sets in 1 year went from 1.5 million to 3.5 million. And as TV sales go up, theatrical audiences went down, very similar to the United States. Feature audiences are cut in half from a peak of 1.12 billion admissions in 1958 to 510 million in 1963, which was the year, not coincidentally necessarily, that Tezuka's Mighty Atom, Astro Boy, premiered on TV. If you're wondering, why was Tezuka interested in television and not theaters? That would be why. So after a brief period of fighting back, including barring their films from airing on TV, the studios gave in. Toei, Shochiku, Toho, Daiei all invest in TV stations and began producing 16mm cheaper films for broadcast. And the studios had to slash production. So Toei went from releasing more than 100 films a year in the 50s to less than 50 by 1965. The double feature trend that was popular in Japan disappeared entirely, while everybody was doing layoffs, staff reduction, closing regional studios, audiences decreasing, cinemas closing, numbers plummeting. Now, why is this important for what we're talking about today? Well, this decrease also means that the studio's stranglehold on the industry is lessened enough to allow for independent distribution and exhibition companies to get a foot in the door. And this is what sparks the Japanese New Wave in part. The ATG, or Art Theater Guild Company, begins exhibition in 1962. They, like Nippon Herald, mainly showed foreign films, which led to a rise in foreign art house fare playing in big cities during the decade. But in 1967, they entered production, where they would typically front half of a production budget that a director's independent company could augment, and this was absolutely crucial to the proliferation of the Japanese New Wave, where directors like Oshima Nagisa and Shinoda Masahiro, Hani Susumu, Matsumoto Toshio, and Yoshida Yoshishige were all making ATG productions like Double Suicide, Inferno of First Love, Funeral Parade of Roses, and Eros Plus Massacre, maybe the single most famous film of the movement because it is what David Desser's book is named after. The Japanese New Wave is defined by Desser in the book of that name as films that were produced and released in the wake of Oshima Nagisa's Town of Love and Hope in 1959. Films which take overtly political stances in a general way or towards a specific issue, utilizing a deliberately disjunctive form compared to previous filmic norms in Japan. It is an avant-garde movement in the sense that it was both the vanguard of a new social movement and it utilized artistic strategies of a new and challenging nature. And it arises in the post-occupation period where Japan has a great deal of political controversy. The Anpo protests over militarization, their relationship with the United States, all sorts of things. But Japan is also now a free democracy that has free speech and a lack of censorship, so those political debates can flourish in a way they had not necessarily done so before. There are many parallels here to the French New Wave, including the fact that both begin in 1959. 1959 is also when we get the release of Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless, which is seen to spark the French New Wave. But two of the biggest differences are that the Japanese New Wave directors are not tied to one specific school of thought and scholarship, the way French New Wave directors are primarily defined through their relationship to the Cahiers du Cinéma magazine and their promotion of auteur theory and other things like that. But also, Japanese New Wave's filmmaking emerges initially from a mainstream commercial context. All of the major films in the beginning of the movement were produced at major commercial studios, particularly Shochiku, which was the earliest to stand down from the let's make a shit ton of movies boom to focus on quality over quantity, which was in their best interest. And most Japanese New Wave directors, again, started out working for the studios where they would make subversive movies within the studio system, and then by the end of the decade they formed their own indie companies, but only after that period of studio involvement. This was a necessity due to the strong studio system and heavy vertical integration of the Japanese industry. Remember, you're not getting into a theater without some kind of studio connection necessarily, at least at the outset of the decade. It also means that the Japanese New Wave is unique in its heavy use of cinemascope, which we will be talking about today with the first two movies that are shot that way, or animated that way in this case, because the majority of films at the time simply had to be made that way. And so the films of this period make really interesting use of that space. Eros plus Massacre is one of the most interesting uses of 239-1 you'll ever see. And I think 1001 Nights, with its really dynamic use of split screens, definitely has an affinity to other films of the period because of that. Now, like every other new wave of the period, including France's and America's, it doesn't sustain for long, tied to the quantity of political activity and the commercial tides of the era, which eventually do subside. In the case of America, Hollywood reasserts itself with films like Jaws and Star Wars. In the case of Japan, the studio system never actually recovers, but animation sort of overtakes it, as well as various kinds of television programs, and theaters just become less and less of a sort of major outlet for filmmaking in the country. The other fallout, well, actually, maybe I should stop there, Sean, and let you comment if you want to say anything about all of that, the new
yes, because this is, I'm certainly not an expert in this stuff, but I've sort of grazed around this kind of period of that late 60s, early 70s. And yes, it's all just very fascinating seeing the way in which that business, really harsh sort of monopolized business conditions slowly start to crumble. And then you get, that it's calling it a wave is a very appropriate term, because as you say, it's not like this super long lasting movement, but you get this really, really vibrant surge of really fascinating movies that use these, sort of filmic techniques in just very kind of jarring, sort of postmodern style that is such a break from what you kind of associated with Japanese movies preceding that. So yes, it's just a very, very interesting period for the industry.
And if you want to know just how sort of uncomfortably Eurocentric film studies is, the fact that the French New Wave gets the attention it does and the Japanese New Wave gets barely any in Western scholarship, I think is very telling, because the Japanese New Wave is definitively a bigger movement. It has more directors, it has more films, it arguably lasts longer. It does fizzle out, but it lasts longer than the French New Wave. And I think there's a lot to talk about there, but for various reasons, some of it being distribution, although I don't think you can blame nearly all of that on it, but I just think there is sort of a Francophile bent to film studies that does not exist for Asian cinema. It has changed a little bit in the years since, but there's always been kind of a bias against anything that is not Eurocentric in film studies. And so this is something that is just generally in a period of rediscovery, which is important. So.
Yeah, and I do feel a lot of these movies, we just have a lot of boutique kind of retailers these days that deal in Blu-rays and 4K Blu-rays, where this stuff is so much more accessible now, which is how I end up seeing it. Is I'll occasionally find something on sale, an interesting collection, and pick it up and watch the movies. And it is cool that we have a market where you can get some of these movies in a way that just was not possible for a long time.
That's very true, and I should call out two specifically: Arrow Academy, the arm of Arrow Video, and Radiance Films have been doing a ton here. These are not generally films you're going to see in the Criterion Collection, other than a couple of Oshimas and a couple of earlier Seijun Suzuki's. But Arrow and Radiance have been doing heroic work getting this stuff out, so that's awesome. But very recent, definitely. All right. The other fallout from this new lack of the studio stranglehold on the industry is the rise of adult theaters and pink films. Pink films, you kind of know them when you see them. They are not pornos. They are not the kinds of things you would think of that Robert De Niro takes the girl to see in Taxi Driver at like a seedy theater. That's not exactly what they are. I like the best way you could describe them is softcore porn, but honestly, 1001 Nights in Cleopatra, those are pink films. Like that's the best way to describe them, is they are movies that are kind of hip and modern, kind of cheeky, very open about talking about sexuality and playing with innuendo, and maybe you'll get some like light nudity, but like it's not hardcore XXX stuff. Does that make sense?
It's more like, I think, what you would think of as you know, a sexploitation style movie, right?
Yes.
Like that's on the softer side. Obviously, you can get movies that would be broadly in that kind of like sexploitation sort of genre that does also have hardcore pornographic scenes inserted into it. Like Caligula would be the most famous example of that. But, you know, obviously this is a thing that not only Japan is doing, but you just have this sort of genre of film that is very sexually open, because obviously we are in the late 60s and early 70s. Like, this is like a broader social movement. And so sex and sexuality is prominently featured as a core element of the film. And so you will have sex scenes, you'll have lots of nudity, but they are not pornographic in nature. And these, you know, they tend to be very kind of, what in a modern movie context you'd kind of call an artsy fartsy movie, right? They're doing more interesting things in terms of like the lighting and the staging and the blocking and the cinematography than your sort of like average film. They're not just there to titillate you. They're there to have some like titillation as a part of it, but they're artistic products, kind of first and foremost in my mind.
Yeah, and we've talked about pink films before on this podcast because Lupin the Third heavily intersects with that whole movement. Like, one of the main writers that we talked about on kind of part 2 and part 3 in some of the movies is someone who comes from the world of pink films. The entire notion that in the late 60s you would try making a Lupin the Third cartoon that is in line with Monkey Punch's comics and have the kind of sex and nudity that is in line with kind of pink film trends didn't quite work out for them on TV, but like Mystery of Mamo is kind of adjacent to this, for instance.
Yeah, Mystery of Mamo feels like it's like a mainstream version of a pink film.
Yes.
Like the ending of that movie where Lupin drops Fujiko's top and presses her nipple like it's a button and the fucking nukes go off. Like, that's a pink film scene, basically.
Yes. 100%. So we've talked about this kind of thing before. In the 60s, a lot of existing cinemas shifted exhibition in this direction. The Nishijin area of Kyoto's traditional theater district, for instance, suffered from stark decrease in attendance and rebranded as adult theaters to survive. The only remaining cinema, the Senbon Nikatsu, became an adult theater in 1971 after the success of Nikatsu's Roman porn line, which was their kind of run of pink films. And in fact, in that year, Nikatsu, which is the oldest still going studio at the time, stopped producing theatrical films for general audiences, period, to focus on pink films. That was their, again, Roman porno series, which was adult films with larger budgets that were very popular. This also intersected with the Yakuza trend at the time. There are a lot of Yakuza movies that are sometimes known as like pinky crime films that would mix titillation with crime themes. Daiei, which is another old studio, that's where like Mizoguchi made all his stuff, they went bankrupt in 1971. And then Toei, Toho, and Shochiku all still exist today, but in the 70s they shifted from production to specializing more in distribution and exhibition. So in 71, Toho split up their production department, and in 73 set up a film adjustment department to select films to be brought in from the outside. And by 73, Toho distributed 48 films a year, only 8 of which they produced. Nikatsu was the only one still mass producing, but only with pink films. And by the time home video and then adult video came out, that put them out of business in 88. So the overall decline of film production happened here. By 1978, the industry stabilized at around 340 films a year, the high having been 547 in 1960, but the bulk of those were pink movies in one way or another. Japanese live-action cinema has never really recovered or risen to the heights of the golden age or new wave period again. Not to say there aren't like great Japanese directors and good movies coming out, but it's a smaller cut of the industry. Like, you would go anime, number 1, you would go kind of like TV dramas, reality shows, number 2, and then boom, 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 boom. Below all that, like live action dramas for theaters, you know, is a kind of different thing. So TV has long remained dominant, and animation obviously became the dominant signature of the film and TV industry at home and worldwide in the decades to come. And suffice it to say, the Animerama Trilogy exists at the intersection of all of these trends and wouldn't exist without all of that stuff happening at once.
Yes, it's basically, I mean, none of these movies are even fathomable to be a movie that you would make today. Like,
Yes.
you just couldn't conceive of it. And so, yes, they are very much movies of their time that are produced because they're movies of that time.
And I would say, again, 1001 Nights and Cleopatra, good examples of pink films, and I would say Belladonna of Sadness should just be in the canon of the Japanese New Wave. Put it next to Eros Plus Massacre and Night and Fog in Japan and the other, big ones, because I think it is very much of a piece with being stridently political, but also, formally really experimental and interested not just in sort of the politics and the story, but the way stories are told through politics. All of that is, there's a reflexivity to it, that it is done through animation, but I think it is a very clear new wave film. And, again, I think speaks to the myopic nature of film distribution in the West, that movie fell to Discotheque. Not to say anything against Discotheque, they did a great job with it, but the fact that that's not a movie like Criterion or Arrow wanted says a lot to me.
Yeah, you're right, because it is a movie that would fit in that mold so clearly, because it has the substance in terms of the storytelling and the themes, but then also the form of it is so out there and is so experimental. It looks so unlike any other animated movie, and especially unlike 1001 Nights and Cleopatra, which they feel like they're just they are from totally different animation traditions.
Yes.
That it's fascinating and funny to think of these as a trilogy of movies.
Yes, but we're going to try our best. So, Sean, do you want to go ahead and start with 1001 Nights, our first movie today?
Yes. So you've got a little bit of notes here, Jonathan. So what led up specifically to 1001 Nights production here?
Yes, this movie was released in June of 1969, but going back to the start of the deal that they inked in 66. So again, they made this deal with Nippon Herald Films. Tezuka's first idea was to do an adaptation of Faust, and the Decameron was also discussed, so you can see the kinds of things they were interested in working with here. They ultimately settled on 1001 Nights, which at the time had multiple popular translations in Japan. I think in America, too, this is when it kind of got popular as a published book. The 1001 Nights, for those who don't know, is a sort of evolving set of mythologies from the Arabic speaking world that grew over time. And so there's a lot of stories that are added to it. There are stories that are not from the actual source text that have kind of been appended to it over time in kind of the international sort of world. But the big difference that this movie makes, for those who don't know the story, is that 1001 Nights is a frame story where a woman is talking to the king and is telling him these stories to keep him interested. And in the movie, they create a character, Alden, who goes through a bunch of the stories. And so that's one of, I think, the most interesting gestures the movie makes narratively, is it creates a protagonist to be consistent throughout the 1001 Nights, which is kind of a fascinating way to do that story.
Yeah, although I was really disappointed that they didn't adapt the frame narrative, because to be more specific, the frame narrative from 1001 Nights is you have the storyteller as a woman named Scheherazade, who the king or sultan he sleeps with a different woman every night, and he has that woman executed in the morning because I think he was cheated on or something like that, and so he doesn't he doesn't want to keep them alive. He wants to their relationship and the purity of that relationship to be there for eternity, so he has them executed, as a king will do, because monarchies are weird. So Scheherazade is then picked as the next woman. She has sex with the king, and then through the rest of the night she tells him a story. And she gets him so interested in the story that he doesn't want to kill her because he wants to hear what's going to happen next. So she comes back the next night. They have sex again. This happens. She tells him another story, so on and so forth. This happens for 1001 Nights. She births multiple children to the king, which is I don't know how the fuck you're doing this. That's a very belabored having to tell a story while you're also giving birth. I don't know what's going on there. But eventually, by the end, he lets her live because he realizes he loves her and all this kind of stuff. And I was kind of shocked that they didn't just adapt that frame narrative, because the frame narrative is not normally brought in. Usually you just sort of adapt, like Aladdin is a story from 1001 Nights, broadly speaking. And like, Aladdin, you can just pluck that story and do that. The Sinbad stories are from 1001 Nights. You can just do a Sinbad movie. But like, I was kind of hoping, knowing this was a Pink film, oh, you can actually adapt the frame narrative, because the frame narrative in and of itself is inherently erotic. It's the kind of frame narrative that would exist in a Pink film, because it is salacious, it is erotic, but it's also violent, which is so much of what these movies like to do. And you don't, I think, would really get much of an opportunity to adapt that frame narrative. And I was bummed that they didn't go for it, that we don't get to see Scheherazade in this.
Well, that's let's just talk about that now, because we can get back to the history in a second. Like, it is interesting, because I was kind of expecting that too, Sean, and I think it could work. And I'm kind of torn, because on one hand, I like how they have the Alden character carried through, and it both starts and ends with him just like on the road. You've got his theme song. I like how he has to just like brush stuff off and keep moving on, and it kind of speaks to like the mutable nature of this whole mythology that he just kind of weaves in and out of it, and I think it's interesting. I also think that if you had the frame narrative, the movie might be paced better. I think if you had someone like, if you had like clear break points where Scheherazade was like telling a story, ending a story, you could like break up the stories through the method of like trying to live to the next day with the king, all of that stuff. I wonder if the movie would be better paced that way. So it's a trade-off, but it is like one of the most interesting things about the movie, and I think the way it tells its story.
Yeah, that it sort of like, it feels like you'd have two paths to adapting 1001 Nights. Either you do the frame narrative and pick a couple of the stories to do, or you pick basically one of the main stories and just adapt to that story a la Aladdin or any of the Sinbad movies. And they kind of picked like a weird middle path of where it's like, we're going to take some stories from 1001 Nights. They also create original stories, or there's a little bit of cribbing from the Odyssey in a couple of places that they're just doing some like other mythologies kind of in kind of mixing them up. And then, yeah, they have this central protagonist, Alden, that I wonder if it's supposed to be Aladdin is his name, and they just like didn't, the way that stuff gets translated from language to language to language over time, who knows if that was supposed to be Aladdin or not, because it feels like you would have just made it Aladdin. He doesn't necessarily do the Aladdin stuff, but he's not that far away from doing the Aladdin stuff.
Right.
In the way that like he does some of the Sinbad stuff, and they turn him into Sinbad partway through the movie. But yeah, it's interesting that they go for this other style. I think I like the movie overall, and I think it does work what they go for. It just feels like a missed opportunity, because I would just be interested in seeing a cool adaptation that takes the frame narrative, because I have not seen that. I'm not an expert on 1001 Nights, and I'm sure that there are good versions out there that have done that. I just have not seen any of them, and I thought this might be one that would do that.
Yeah. But in any case, that is the story they chose. One thing to note with all of this is that the contract Mushi Pro had with Nippon Herald to make these movies was not particularly advantageous to Mushi Pro. They would have to put a lot of their own money on the line, and they would have to make a very big return to see a profit. But for reasons we talked about in the Dororo episode, Tezuka and company really wanted to push this envelope. They wanted to move in a more adult direction. Tezuka was always experimenting. They always wanted to try new things. And so, Mushi Pro had created a number of avant-garde and experimental shorts. Their first production, Tales of a Certain Street Corner, is like a 30-minute kind of experimental narrative. They had a lot of shorts over the years. There is a DVD collection in Japan that I have found a rip of that has all of the experimental shorts they did over the years. So this was like, even though it was risky financially, on one hand, I do wonder if there was kind of a YOLO thing going on here of like, we're fucked. Tezuka is not good at running the money side of this thing. So this is like, we're on the line anyway. Let's just do it. Let's just make a big fucking movie. And that is kind of what they decided to do. Production on the movie was really complicated, in part because of the same issues that complicated all Mushi Pro productions. Tezuka was overextended, working on dozens of projects. Recall that when he serialized Dororo, he was also serializing 10 other manga at the same time. So the movie had a lot of delays. Getting the film over the finish line required a huge amount of outsourcing, and basically everyone in the Mushi Pro studio itself touched the film at one point or another, including very long stretches of crunch near the end. So big effort, and you can see the unevenness in the production, although I think the unevenness is also part of the appeal of the production, because that's very much the kind of thing it's doing. So yes, the film is experimental not only in its style, but in its technique. Probably too many to list, including some cool stuff it does that Cleopatra also does with live action inserts, with filming literal smoke and having it billow over the image in scenes that are supposed to have fire. But those live action inserts are really striking. They built a full model miniature of Baghdad that is used throughout the film, and then they would sometimes have animated figures on top of that, and that is reminiscent of techniques that Fleischer Studios used in their work, including Popeye. The two-reel Technicolor Popeye short, Popeye the Sailor meets Sinbad the Sailor, the Sinbad connection, is one of the most famous examples of Fleischer animating characters atop miniatures and models, and we know Tezuka was a huge Fleischer fan growing up, very influential on him, and so I have to imagine that short was an influence here, because if you've seen the two of them, like, there's too many kind of like stylistic similarities, including that it is also a 1001 Nights like tie-in. So that was interesting. The voice casts for all three of these movies blow my fucking mind, and they are so fascinating to talk about. I did even more notes on the other ones because they just kept leveling up what they were doing. But even for this first one, the cast was considered A-list for the time, but it did not use anime actors, even in the kind of sense of like, what an anime actor was kind of in flux at this time. Even for that influx definition, they went in a different direction. So, for instance, the star of the movie, Alden, is voiced by Aoshima Yukio, who was an extreme multi-hyphenate. He wrote books, he performed songs, he hosted TV, he acted in films. He eventually became a politician who served 5 terms in Japan's House of Councilors from 1968 to 1989, and again from 1992 to 1995, and later became the governor of Tokyo for 1 term from 1995 to 1999. And he is not the last politician we're talking about today, because these movies were crazy.
Yes, I can only assume that he saw Alden become king at the end of 1001 Nights. Is like, you know what? I'd like them to make a giant fucking tower. I wonder if can I do that in Japan? I'd love to just have a huge fucking tower. It'd be pretty sick. And you know, it's like I got a politician, got to make it.
Sean, he was already in the house at the time this movie was made. True. Like, can you imagine if today Pixar lost their mind and made an erotic Toy Story or something, and it starred Hakeem Jeffries? Like someone from the House of Representatives? Like, what the fuck would that be like? Like, it's wild.
Yeah, it is fucking weird as shit.
And then most of the other actors in the movie are theater actors, specifically Kishida Kyoko, who plays the dual role of Miriam and Jaris, which is Alden's lover and then daughter, and also lover. Akutagawa Hiroshi, who plays Bodley, and Koike Asao, who plays Kamar Kim, were all members of the Gekidan Kumo, which was a famous theater company that performed from 1963 to 1975. This would have been right in the middle of like their period of success, and so a lot of these are theater actors. And we're going to see more of that in the other movies as well. Although again, the voice actors just keep getting more interesting with these 3 movies, and that was like my favorite part of my notes. Honestly, was like diving into Japanese Wikipedia to learn about these people. Like, honestly, somebody like Aoshima Yukio, the Alden actor, is sort of like, I think the closest parallel you would have today is Beat Takeshi, someone who like is everywhere, is a media personality, is also an artist, is also an author, but with the difference that Beat Takeshi has never run for office. So, you know, there's that.
Yes.
Yet he is still kicking, he's still out there, he could do it. Yeah,
I'd vote for him. I mean, I'm not a Japanese citizen. I'd commit vote fraud to try to get him in office. I'll say that on a podcast. I'm not afraid to do it.
Well, Sean, you might have to, because he does have, an in with the Yakuza. So, yeah. I don't actually know that for sure. I'm just saying he's made a lot of Yakuza movies. They're not particularly realistic Yakuza movies, but, Anyway, the film 1001 Nights was a true hit. Like, this is the one of the 3 that had a lot of success in Japan. It made 290 million yen and ranked 5th for the year in 1969. So that's no small feat. But the director of the movie, Yamamoto Eiichi, claims the film was overall a loss for Mushi Pro due to the amount of money they had put in, mainly because of the amount of outsourcing they had to do, which is not cheap, and the deal with Nippon Herald. So even when they had the 5th ranked movie of the year, they weren't making money on it. That's the Mushi Pro touch.
Yes. I mean, honestly, it's not surprising because there is this like interesting thing watching 1001 Nights where the movie simultaneously looks incredibly expensive and it also looks really roughshod at the same time. Where it does have all these cool experimental techniques. It's got all this like crazy shit going on. It is a very elaborate film. It's a long animated movie. It's over 2 hours long.
131 minutes. It's huge.
Yeah, so it's a super long animated film. But at the same time, it is so sort of slipshod in terms of what styles it's depicting. The animation is incredibly inconsistent. Even compared to like Cleopatra, which I think like gets a little bit more of a handle on exactly what kind of animation it wants to look like from scene to scene, outside of like the really experimental stuff. But just in terms of regular people talking kind of scenes, 1001 Nights is very sort of all over the place. So I think that there's something very charming about that. But it is an interesting production in that sense. And that one thing I want to hit on that you had in your notes is that Fleischer connection, because this movie fascinates me in that it feels like it is full from the Fleischer tradition of animation. Whereas most Japanese anime, you think of it as being like broadly evolving from like the Disney side of things, because broadly speaking, it more or less did. Obviously, you insert like your limited animation techniques and stuff like that, but it always felt like the like appeal was towards a Disney-like overall style.
Well, because Tezuka's main influence in his manga and his early anime that was a hit was Disney. Like, Mighty Atom trends Disney. The Dororo characters look like Disney characters. Nota in Dororo is a Disney dog. Like, that's, I think, part of why that just gets kind of invested in there, is because of those early stylistic touchstones. Yeah.
But so the Fleischer style, there's like a few things that make it feel like that, because one, it is the adult nature of it inevitably makes it feel like that anyways, so, right? Like, one of like the early big successes of Fleischer is Betty Boop, back in the 20s, in the 30s, obviously, which is like, very tame compared to 1001 Nights, but for the time is a very sexualized character, very sexualized cartoon depicting like the flapper culture and stuff like that of the time. And so the more adult nature is very Fleischer-esque, but it's also the way that characters move, where the Disney style is meant to like reflect a sort of exaggerated sense of real world physicality, right? So there's like this sense of weight and momentum to the movement of characters. And this is like really important to early Disney. If you're watching something like Snow White and you're looking at how luscious the movement of the characters are, the way the cloth moves, it's so studied and so precise. And those different kind of principles of animation, that of like character peel and anticipation and follow through, squash and stretch and all that kind of stuff that is developed through like the early Disney animators, that is all done to create this sort of verisimilitude where it is very animated and it has a cartoonish reality to it, but it has a reality to it. And that's one of the things that really defines the Disney style. Whereas Fleischer is super like underground, and it is like, we're going to make animation look like nothing else. Like, it's not going to resemble reality. The way that our animated characters are going to move is going to ignore the laws of reality in every way, shape, or form. So you don't get those sort of like common touchstones of anticipation and follow through that creates a complete sense of movement. Movement can be very jerky. It can be very sudden. And if you watch any of those like really early Betty Boop kind of cartoons, you will see how that style sort of creates this very different, very rough kind of atmosphere. And that's so what 1001 Nights looks. There are cuts that are less like that, but most of the animation of the characters in the movie very resembles that to me. And it has this very sudden sort of like non-physicalized movement of the characters. And it's very fascinating because this is a thing that there are American animated material from this time, from the late 60s, early 70s, that is like this, that brings this back. The big one we'll talk about a little bit with Cleopatra is Fritz the Cat, where you have, oh God, what's the name of that director again? I'm blanking on his name.
He made The Lord of the Rings also, and his name is Ralph Bakshi.
Yeah, Ralph Bakshi. Like, his whole sort of style is also very much like pulling from that old Fleischer stuff and using it to create like modern erotic and like super politically charged, the like American equivalent of your Pink film, a sort of sexploitation kind of movie. That's what Fritz the Cat is, and other things that he did from that period. So it's just, I found it really fascinating immediately upon booting up this movie because I had no expectations. I didn't know what it really looked like. I didn't know anything about it other than it was some sort of adaptation of 1001 Nights. I was just really shocked to see the way that it looked and the way that characters moved, because I've never seen anime where characters move like this. I've never seen anime that is pulling so directly from that Fleischer tradition to where it just resembles that kind of production overall.
Yeah. And, it's kind of funny. So the week we're recording this, I was just teaching my students, we had a unit on limited animation. And one of the things I kind of wanted to correct from past times I've talked about that on this show, like the Dororo episode, is that limited animation isn't just a cost-saving thing. It comes out of an entire alternative view of what animation could be. The first limited animation sort of cartoon, the one that is considered like the start of it, is a 1942 Chuck Jones short at WB called The Dover Boys, and Chuck Jones didn't have budgetary restrictions on these things. He, this is over at Looney Tunes. It's one of, 50 shorts they made that year, and he was like literally encouraged by the people at Warner's, like, make it look less Disney, and what he came up with in kind of this modernist style later inspired the people who formed UPA, who did the Mr. Magoo shorts and Gerald McBoing Boing and all of that stuff, and some of the hallmarks of limited animation are things that have become like very important to anime, like having visible brushstrokes in the background, having less filled in backgrounds, having more kind of flat planes of vision and not going for the Disney multiplane thing. And Tezuka's first production, which was also the first thing directed by Yamamoto Eiichi, that Tales of a Certain Street Corner, is a like very lush version of limited animation. And you can see them getting back to that, I think, in this movie and Cleopatra in a lot of ways, in places where, like, it's like herky-jerky and weird because it's not quote-unquote Disney full animation, but it's not cheap. It's not done for cost-saving measures. There are absolutely inconsistencies in the production, as you said, and that's very true for this movie. But we're also seeing them kind of experiment with, I think, the formalism of like modern art as like a basic idea of having sometimes very flat backgrounds. And this is before we get to things like the way they depict sex scenes in this movie through like use of silhouettes and like just lines going around and kind of doing whatever they want. And I think some of that is also like very Fleischer. But it is an interesting thing because Fleischer would have been like their famous stuff, like Betty Boop, Out of the Inkwell, Popeye, is before we would ever have made the distinction between full and limited animation. And Fleischer would be full animation. Like, they use a lot of frames. It's very elaborate stuff. So that 1001 Nights is this interesting thing where it's like interpolating Fleischer techniques with limited animation modernist sensibilities. And I think that's part of why it feels so unique, is because we're used to seeing a lot of Disney techniques interpolated through a limited animation lens, and that is what creates early anime. This is the opposite route, and I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and so it's like, it has such a unique overall look. And even Cleopatra, which has some similar things, it doesn't go as far as 1001 Nights does. Like, they pull back on it with Cleopatra in a lot of places and make it a more conventional. It's not conventional compared to anything else.
No.
But it is more conventional. 1001 Nights is just, it is, anarchic is the word I keep on coming back to in my head, because that is what the movie feels like. It is representing this very kind of hippie mentality, with the Alden character of him coming in with nothing on his back, him rising up to the heights of everything, him letting it all go and going back with nothing but the clothes on his back again. Like, that quality of the story so synergizes with the very strange, weird, sort of, mercurial style of the overall movie, and where it's going from scene to scene and plot beat to plot beat and aesthetic choice from aesthetic choice. And all of them are strange and kind of unravel in different ways. And it's all, in its sort of like, incongruity, it all comes together to feel like one kind of very coherent vision in an almost paradoxical way. And that's the thing I really like about it, because that's what mythology is. Mythology is a weird, bizarre collection of disparate stories told by God knows how many people, mostly speaking to each other and passing it down orally over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of years. And at some point it getting written down by some motherfucker, and then now we read it. And so all mythology that exists today that is from, kind of classical or like pre-modern cultures has this quality of this incoherency, like God knows how many different explanations there are for like how Achilles was born and all that kind of shit. And like, all those different elements that we think of as Greek mythology that in a modern world we kind of think of as set in stone, they were not set in stone. Those stories evolved, and you're, depending on what you read, you're going to get a different version of those myths, whether you're reading Ovid's Metamorphoses or you're going Homeric and reading the Odyssey, and there's someone that references some sort of myth, right? Like, and this is also how 1001 Nights works, where a lot of like stories that people think of that are super famous 1001 Nights stories, like Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, was not original story. It's not even an Arabic story. It is a story written by, I believe, a French guy in the mid fucking 19th century. And so that really chaotic, like amorphous sense of storytelling, which is what we think of as modern lens as mythology, that gels with everything that this movie is doing stylistically and in terms of its writing. And so even though it's long in the tooth, it does get fairly dull in a couple of places. I don't think it's a perfect movie. It is a fascinating movie as someone who loves mythology to see how can you represent these kinds of ideas on screen in a different way.
I would completely agree with that. And I think like that is its biggest strength, is I think the way it pairs the character, the loose, rough character of mythology with this loose, anarchic style where it just changes every couple minutes into being something different, and it's throwing ideas out left and right. And like, I agree with you. I think this movie is long in the tooth. I think it's like way too long at 131 minutes. But you'll never be like bored, really. Like, it's surprising you consistently. And I did think both with this and Cleopatra that I wonder if a film is even the ideal form for this thing, or if like you could split it up into a series of shorts that would be more compelling on that term. But I think for this movie specifically, the general accumulation of styles and things kind of bouncing off of each other with the loose through line of Alden, but it is a very loose through line. That is what is compelling. That is what feels fun. And that is what makes it feel like nothing else. I would like to see this movie get a proper restoration one day, because the other thing is the version that we have, I think, is just the early 2000s DVD master prepared by the modern version of Mushi Pro for release in Japan. Like, it's very clearly a DVD era master. It's like the kind of like edge enhancement you see at the top and bottom of the frame. The way it's, I don't even think it's a struck from like the film's negative. It like reel to reel, the movie's quality changes a lot. And so there's a whole other layer of like presentational, not mismanagement, but like difference to it. There's like unevenness that I don't know if that's reflective of the film itself. Like, I would love to see if the negative exists and we could get a proper 4K scan, like was done for Belladonna of Sadness, and like see this movie in closer to what it would have looked like in theaters. That would be very interesting to me, because it is a little tough to separate the two, because the Blu-ray we have is just, again, it's a 30-year-old DVD master at this point, or 20-year-old. And so that is kind of an interesting thing about it. But it is still, even through that, frequently like very striking on a production level. I love particularly when it just tries things that are like kind of out of its reach, like the entire Tower of Babylon thing it tries to do. And the way it has to depict that and all of that. It's like, it is such an ambitious thing the movie goes for. And I love the like tricks and things they do to try to like make it work. It's fascinating. I love also that, you know, and this is true of a lot of films of the time, it wants to be sexy and erotic, but it can't show actual sex. So what do we do with that? And there's fascinating things throughout that are their answers to those questions. But before we go further with that, do you want to talk quickly about the crew and the people who made this movie?
Yes, yeah. So who are some of the people responsible for this very strange film?
And we'll be talking about almost all of them again. So let's start with the man himself, Yamamoto Eiichi, who directed all three of these movies. He is not just a Mushi Pro vet, but the other main Mushi Pro guy besides Tezuka himself. He was there from the very beginning. He directed their first production, Tales of a Certain Street Corner. Artistically, I think it would be correct to call him Tezuka's right-hand man at this particular studio. And these three films are probably his most famous contributions from these years, and maybe his biggest single collapse, or his biggest single legacy, because after the collapse of Mushi Pro, he worked on a few other major things. He worked on Space Battleship Yamato and the Star Blazers TV series, but for the most part, he did not work in anime past the 1970s. You talked about this, Sean, last when we talked about Dororo, that the Mushi Pro vets are people who either went on to be like the founding fathers of anime and are still working today if they're alive, or they got through half of the 70s and went, fuck this, I'm out. And Yamamoto Eiichi was kind of a fuck this, I'm out guy.
Yeah, it's one of the great costs of this period. It
Yes.
is shocking when you look at those credits. You're like, oh, yep, no, like most of these people just sort of, for one reason or another, they just totally burned out of the industry and never came back.
Yeah. There is no storyboard credit on this film, but we do know that Tezuka and Yamamoto made storyboards based on the script, and that the character designer and art director Yanase Takashi contributed to them as well. So that is the storyboard situation. In terms of the screenplay, you have Tezuka Osamu credited on the screenplay, as well as original plan and executive producer, so he came up with kind of the main draft. But then the other two writers credited are Fukasawa Kazuo and Kumai Hiroyuki. Fukasawa had also written The Great Adventure of Horus, Prince of the Sun, for Toei in 1968, which is a anime landmark for any number of reasons, including being the feature directorial debut of Takahata Isao, while Kumai was a theater writer, known for his work with the Tokyo Theater Ensemble. The story, as you might imagine watching the movie, changed a lot during development. Yamamoto claims that Tezuka's original plot outline was very long and unwieldy, and that it would have run 4 hours, so Yamamoto brought in Fukasawa and Kumai to revise it. And you'll notice that Kumai, who is the theater guy, is the kind of person he then hires for Cleopatra and Belladonna when he has a little more control over that side of things. So those are the people who wrote it. On music is a guy we've already met, Tomita Isao. He was the composer on Dororo and future godfather of electronic music, who has a whole legacy that we're not going to get into, but because good legacy. That sounded like he did something wrong. To my knowledge, nothing wrong, but he is a huge musician. But this movie also has some rock songs by the Helpful Soul, including vocals on the theme song by the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, Charlie Kosei, the singer from Lupin the Third Part 1. And the joy in my mind when this started up and you've got him singing Alden like he used to sing Lupin the Third. I'm like, this fucking rocks. This is great.
Yeah, I mean, the music top to bottom is fucking phenomenal.
It's so
I mean,
good.
It's very good in all three of these movies. But there is this, like, I don't know. This is something that this movie has in common with Belladonna of Sadness. Cleopatra is stylistically a little bit different, but there's a pseudo rock opera concept album quality to the music that I'm way into. There's a lot of like the Who's Tommy in this and in Belladonna of Sadness, just in terms of the style, the way they write the lyrics, the use of like just the sounds of the guitar, particularly like the bass guitar. It's just so this late 60s, early 70s, like leading into, it's not quite prog rock, but it's almost prog rock. We're like almost to Pink Floyd, but we're not at Pink Floyd yet kind of quality to the music that I'm like way into. And I think it's super cool, particularly the 1001 Nights, where it is not it's not going for some sort of like Arabic sounding soundscape. It's not trying to pretend to be that, which is good, because the movie, I think if you tried to take the movie seriously as an adaptation of 1001 Nights, it would completely fall apart. It would be very offensive for a whole number of different, like, culturally insensitive reasons for things that happen in the movie. But if you take it as this, like, there is this sort of veneer of 1001 Nights and assorted mythological stories like the Tower of Babylon, like the Sirens / the Lotus Eaters / Kirky, which they kind of mash up from the Odyssey into one big thing in the middle of the movie. Like it's a veneer of all that on top of this like 60s hippie story. And so the music exists in that whole hippie rock vibe. And yeah, the movie beginning and ending with this sick song with Charlie Kosei and this great sounding electric bass as Alden is wandering through the desert. It is a mood and a half, and I'm here for it.
And I didn't find anything specifically to tie this to Lupin the Third Part 1, but I find it impossible to imagine that there wasn't a link here, because we know at the time of this movie's production, Sugi Gizaburo, the guy who directed Dororo and founded Art Fresh, was also contracting on the Lupin the Third pilot film. And while that's being made, of course, they're doing this, and then they make the show, which has Charlie Kosei and a very similar music style to the main songs here. And again, obviously part of that is just culture to the time, but I also have to think that there was some kind of like, this was a hit movie. This is the kind of like Mad Magazine pink film madness that like Lupin the Third, its initial incarnation in Part 1 is going for. And that whole thing of just having a dude singing about your main character like he's in a fucking lounge is so awesome and like fits Lupin so well, as we talked about on that episode. And I do feel like this is like the clear precursor to that if you arrange them chronologically.
Yeah, it is like, I'm sure whether it is directly or indirectly, this movie is in some way responsible for a lot of stuff in Lupin the Third Part 1, because I do think there's a clear, they're all part of the same movement of let's take these things that are becoming in vogue in the live action space and find a way to bring that into animation. And this is doing it with theatrical animation. Lupin the Third Part 1 did it with TV animation, but they're both so of a piece that, there has to be some sort of connection there, at least through inspiration.
Yes. So then for our character designer and art director, we have Yanase Takashi, and this is also a trend with these three movies, is that they picked really interesting people who are very famous outside of these movies. So Yanase was recommended the job by Sugi Gizabuto, who we already mentioned a couple of times, and he would have been working on Dororo in parallel to this film. So that's why Sugi is involved in this movie, but in a kind of limited capacity. There's certain scenes he contributes to, but he was very busy. But Yanase himself is a cartoonist who was most famous as the creator of Anpanman. Mm-hmm. When I learned that, Sean, I went, what? What are we talking about today? Because if you don't know Anpanman, that is not a show that has traveled outside of Japan a ton, but it is Japan's longest running children's franchise. It was published continuously from 1973 to the author's death in 2013. By the 2000s, Anpanman had officially become Japan's single highest grossing character, overtaking Hello Kitty, and its anime adaptation has gone like 3 One Pieces or something at this point. Like, just insane. So Yanase, very, very big name to bring in here. He had not created Anpanman yet, but he was already a big deal, I think, in the world of cartooning. And of course, it is just very funny to me that the creator of Anpanman did 1001 Nights, because those are different things.
Yes, yeah. I don't think there's some sort of elaborate avant-garde sex scene in Anpanman of him melting into another bread person in a like elaborate dance of penciling. Yeah, I think that's not quite where Anpanman went.
Yes, but Yanase also contributed to the storyboards of the film, so he was very heavily involved. And then our animation director is Miyamoto Sadao, who worked at Mushi Pro since its founding, where he was most prominent as the character designer, art director, and animation director all in one on Princess Knight, which is one of their most famous shows of the period. He is also one of the people who stepped back from the anime industry later on, although he kept a foot inside and would come back every so often. He did a lot of work kind of in the OVA boom. And then he also is credited on basically all of the Disney Renaissance films. So like Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, later on like Tarzan. I think his last credit is Lilo and Stitch. And I don't know what he did. It was very hard for me to find details on that, but those are his like last set of credits in his lifetime. So I think that's fascinating.
I'm sure he's very excited for the live action Lilo and Stitch. I'm sure he's
I think Miyamoto Sadao is dead, and if so, I'm glad for him that he does not have to live to see that, because he died actually. Oh my God, he just died last year. Yeah, he died 1 year ago this month. But anyway, I am frankly, he lived a long life, and I'm glad he does not have to live to see whatever they're going to do with his baby over there in Lilo and Stitch. Because if I made Lilo and Stitch, I would not want to live to see whatever the fuck that is. I just watched Lilo and Stitch, and I don't want to live to see what the fuck that is. So Jesus Christ. Anyway, sorry. If you get me going on Disney live-action remakes, we're never going to stop. So there we go.
Sorry.
And then we've got lots of Mushi Pro vets contributing to the art and animation. I did want to highlight in particular Sugi Gizabuto, who was influential on all 3 of these movies. We covered his interest in more adult-oriented animation on the Dororo episode, so he was certainly enthusiastic about participating in these movies. And to my understanding, I think he was able to do more on Cleopatra, and then he was one of the main creators on Belladonna of Sadness. But for this scene in particular, he drew the sequence on the Island of Women, the episode you were talking about earlier, that is like a very transnational, like 3 different mythologies coming into one. But it has one of the film's most memorable sex scenes, the one that is like sort of hands that then become pencil drawings that twist and turn into various shapes. Very, very memorable sequence.
Yes, it is the standout sequence of this movie for sure. He did 2 scenes, because you linked to me, there's that one interview that you linked to me that you found with Sugi Gizabuto talking about the Animerama Trilogy. And one of the parts of that is he breaks down, he did that scene, and then there's also a scene, I believe this is earlier in the movie, where all the the 40 thieves, basically, from the Alibaba and 40 Thieves story, the thieves in the cave, they're all like getting drunk and having this big party and dancing.
Yes.
That is also him. And that makes a lot of sense because that's very much like the Fujiko scene in the Lupin pilot film that he also animated.
He might have been animating at the same time as this.
It's true. Yeah. But yes, and he did 2 sequences on Cleopatra. One of them is a sex scene very similar to that, and then there's the symmetrical sex scene near the end of that movie we'll talk about. And then he was the animation director on Belladonna of Sadness, and he was particularly responsible for the Black Death sequence in that movie, was what that interview kind of broke down. But yeah, his stuff in this movie, particularly that sex scene, is so incredible. I mean, that whole sequence, that whole kind of episode of the story, I think is the best part of the movie. There's something so kind of like pure to it in that mythological sense of him sort of like ending up kind of deposited on this island and it doing the siren thing from the Odyssey, right, where he's sort of allured by these beautiful women and he comes to them. And then it kind of pulls the Lotus Eaters from the Odyssey, which is the land where Odysseus and his men go to early in that section of the Odyssey. Because remember, that's not actually the beginning of the Odyssey.
Right.
A thing that Christopher Nolan will have to confront. Apparently, he's making fucking Odyssey movie. I don't know what that's going to mean.
Here's what Christopher Nolan should do. IMAX prologue that is just the Telemachy, and it's like 40 minutes before something else, and then he does the Odyssey as like a 5-hour epic.
Yeah, that's a whole different can of worms, what that will be. But the Lotus Eaters are where Odysseus and his men go, and the Lotus Eaters eat these leaves, the lotus leaves, that cause them to forget things. And so Odysseus has to like drag his men back, be like, fuck this, we are not staying on this island because we will never leave if we stay here. And so it's got that sort of like the drug-induced haze of the Lotus Eaters, and then it's got this Kirke or Circe-like quality where she is the witch on one of the other islands Odysseus visits, that if you eat her porridge, it turns you into pigs. And there's like the snake stuff here is like very Kirke-esque, the kind of like metamorphosis of these women. And yeah, that whole sequence I just found very mesmerizing from beginning to end, and with the centerpiece of it being the sex scene that just goes into this whole different space, and it is so sort of shapeless and mutable where you're not sure what you're looking at, and it's like at times you're seeing like these hands coming together and breaking apart and then forming together, and there's all this sort of like sexualized imagery of these two people melding, but you also have these sort of like serpent-like motif of it all becoming this one long kind of strand. And then obviously the reveal of the scene later is that, oh, this is a woman who literally turns into a snake. And so there is this just very primal, really great mythic mode that the story is working on at that point. You know, that you kind of have to put some of like the misogyny of it aside, because I do think that this movie and Cleopatra have a very misogynistic trend to them in terms of how they handle a lot of the female characters. Particularly the one woman who's like the daughter of the thieves. I think I hate what they do with that character in this movie. And there's obviously this long trend of depicting women in stories as these seductresses that like bring you over and kill you and all this kind of stuff. That's a whole thing. You have to put some of that aside, and I think just sort of appreciate some of what the movie is doing in working in this mode, and the artistry of how they are depicting this like very sort of classical kind of myth. That I just found it really fascinating as someone who really enjoys mythology and studied it a lot, and then teaches it now. I just think this is such a cool way to represent those things in the feeling of it on screen in a movie, and kind of translating some of that experience while also creating their own original variation of it. It's not just an adaptation of those stories. They're pulling elements of those stories and putting out something that's new and different.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And in terms of the representation of sex, I think this is where you really have to like break off the first two from Belladonna of Sadness, because I think Belladonna has a completely different relationship with sex, sexuality, nudity, and just like the interiority of the main character. Like, it is interested in Jeanne as a woman, as a human, in a way these first two are not interested in the women as humans.
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, this was not like... You can't paint ever with too broad a brush with Tezuka because he wrote so much stuff, but he had kind of a schizophrenic relationship with this. There are some stories where I think he does very well by women, and he has really deep interests in like gender and gender roles, like Princess Knight probably being his most famous one. And there's ones where it is more just kind of the period, kind of casually sexist. And I think these movies fall into an interesting trap where there's the surface level titillation which is like literally just the word in titillation tit. There's just a lot of boobs out in these movies. Like,
yes.
the women in this movie and Cleopatra basically never have their tops on. Like, they are basically, if there's a woman in one of these movies, you are seeing their breasts basically at all times. And it's very, like, simplistic drawings of breasts. This is not like Studio Gainax, anime boob jiggle physics, right? Like, we're not there yet. It's like, it's much like more kind of Mad Magazine, or if you've read the Lupin the Third Monkey Punch comics, much more like that.
Or like the Playboy comics,
Sure, yeah.
Like it's just of that, style of the period, that the way you would depict nudity.
And so that top level layer is just very, it's horny, it's male gazy. It's not particularly deep, I think, in either direction. Like, I think I would say you're correct about the daughter of the thieves. That character, Mardia, I think is more on the line of being a misogynistic representation, because it's just so one note what they do with her. For the most part, I think it's just very like kind of 60s casual sexism that you see in a lot of this. And I'm not saying that to excuse it or anything. It's just there's not a lot of depth to it. But then you have the other layer of the movie, which is how it actually depicts intercourse, which is interesting, which is like, because I think there are 3 big sex scenes in the movie, and they to me are the 3 pillars of this film. And it is the early one with his lover Miriam, that I think is really interesting in how it depicts, like, because you have a lot of horniness at the beginning, and then there's this scene of actual passion, and the way it chooses to depict that is fascinating. There's the one on the Island of Women where their bodies become one, become serpentine, become, ironically for Anpanman, dough-like, all of that. And then there's the third scene, which is done through reflection in water with silhouettes. And I think it's like literally a mix of live action, water, like photography, and like light. And I think all of that is fascinating. But I think there is this weird schizophrenia to the movie where its interest in sex, I think, is artistically quite deep and quite interesting. But its interest in eroticism is just, hey, there's boobs.
Yeah, and that's like just something that I think it inherits from its pink film contemporaries, right? Like, that's just so much the attitude that the pink films have, where there's like, sexual violence is more or less a guarantee at some sort of level. You're like more or less guaranteed to have your sort of, your whole like range of different sort of like 70s tropes of like sexual violence, and then the woman like falling in love with or being in some way entangled with the man who commits sexual violence on her. And there's like the femme fatale tropes. So much of the pink film stuff is also wrapped up in like film noir type storytelling tropes, because there's so often some sort of crime adjacent genre involving police and or gangs and or assassins or whatever. And that's partially just through necessity that the live action movies have to do that, because they have to be made for fucking cheap, right? You're not seeing a pink film that's 1001 Nights adaptation in live action, or you're not likely to see something like that, because that's fucking expensive to make, because you can't just use an actual like street to shoot on. You can't use actual cars, right? You have to get horses and make carts, and you have to have a whole big elaborate set and all that kind of stuff. So the thing that 1001 Nights is able to do is it's able to have this very fantastical kind of world and setting it builds, because that's as expensive for this as anything. But it is still sort of inherits a lot of like the sort of standard ways it thinks of depicting the female characters. But I do think you're right that if you sort of separate out these sort of tired, tropey kind of ways that uses the female characters in the movie, and you look at just the depiction of sex itself as an action and what that like signifies, I do think, and this is true of all the movies, it's where the movies come alive the most. Like, it's where they feel like it is the thing that they want to depict. And in some ways, maybe that does make them pornographic movies. It's just the nature of that pornography is very different. It is interested in the act of sex and depicting the act of sex, but it's not interested in depicting the act of sex as a masturbatory aid, right? It is there to investigate it from an artistic perspective, and how do you explore that, kind of very ephemeral, almost kind of dreamlike space. And yeah, that's where the movie is, I think, the most interesting on its own terms. And that's another place where it congeals really well with the mythological inspirations, because those mythological stories are very sexually charged. Whether you're talking about the Odyssey, Like, God knows how many women Odysseus sleeps with over the course of that story on his, like, journey to get back to his wife, whom he loves so much and wants to get back to. And he's like, man, I just can't help but sleep with all these beautiful women along the way. God damn it. Or obviously 1001 Nights has its whole frame narrative that's super sexually charged. One of the other ones you mentioned as, like, a potential thing they thought about adapting was the Decameron, which is a story of 100 Italian short stories of various genres, many of them very sexually charged, very sexually explicit. And so it's just, it was super common. And it's one something you kind of expect from mythology and folkloric storytelling, particularly from a pre-modern period. And so I think that there's something cool about seeing all those different influences come together in this movie and how it chooses to depict those things in this really interesting avant-garde filmic style.
Yes, I would agree with that. And yeah, so there is like, if you're listening to this and you haven't seen these movies yet, which I think is a more normal expectation for this episode than some of the other ones we've done, which is fine. I would say you do, I think, have to have a bit of historical awareness to go into this and not be kind of flabbergasted by it, because it is so rooted in its time. And like, if I were to teach this, I would have to give a big, long intro about everything we're doing today, basically, right? And I think you do have to kind of have some cognitive separation of expectation versus where is like actual like artistic work going into this, and where is artistic work maybe falling flat in other places. But yeah, overall, I dig it. I really also like the section, and the Island of Women is part of this, where he just becomes Sinbad. I thought that was actually fairly clever to just say, like, well, we want to do some Sinbad stories. Our main character is Alden. Why doesn't he just call himself Sinbad? Fuck it. He's like going out and getting treasure. And I like all of that. I like how the way they depict the high seas is they just went and shot some B-roll of the ocean, and then we get to put that in, and it looks really cool. And I love all of that. I love how that's also where he meets he basically does get a genie at one point. And that is where we do the 15-year time jump, so that when he comes back, he's super rich and he's able to like go become challenged to become the king. I think that sequence where he has the basically fight with all the treasures to show like who has the greater treasures, that sequence rocks. It's really good. The movie gets weirdly incesty near the end, where the tension of the final stretch is, will he fuck his daughter or not? But he doesn't in the end, and they all take it in stride, and he gets outcast, which is probably what he deserves. So it's a weird movie, but again, I dug it.
Hey, man, if there's one thing that mythology likes, it's incest.
It's very true.
It's omnipresent. It is unavoidable. It's a thing that's going to happen. And as you say, like, he doesn't actually go through with it. And I do think, like, I actually think it's, like, a very effective use of that, of Alden's character, of, this sort of, like, potential incest with his daughter that he obviously does not know is his daughter, but he sees this woman he loved, whom he lost, in her, because she quite literally is in her, right? Yes. On a genetic level. And so it's him as this older, more bitter man who's also doing all these horrible things as the king, wanting to reclaim this one great thing from his youth that he lost and couldn't get back. And he has to learn that you can't get that back, right? And that because both for the literal reason of it's incestuous, but also for like the metaphysical reason in which it is incestuous, in which you're trying to like go back and procreate with the thing that is gone, that is lost, and like trying to do it again. You can't do it. It is a taboo, and you must move on with your life. And so he lets it all crumble and walks away laughing as it all goes to the ground. Like, I think that element of the ending, I think, is actually very effectively done. And it's a really tricky tightrope to walk anytime you insert incest into a story in any context. I think this movie is actually a very effective illustration of how you can use that and use it to actually support your themes very well. And one of the reasons why incest is very omnipresent in mythology, because it's one of the ways in which it is used.
I think that's very true. And as someone who has had to teach psychoanalysis several times, and I always have to back up and explain what the Oedipus myth is, and then I have to explain why Freud uses the Oedipus myth so much, I've had to have the uncomfortable conversation with students and be like, no. We're talking about incest for academic reasons. And I think, it's something people are kind of weirdly sensitive about, considering how popular it is in so much literature today and movies today. Not to mention, fucking Pornhub searches or whatever. But, I think this is a I don't think that is just there for titillation and shocks. I think you're correct. There's in line with other mythologies like the Oedipal myth, there is a real story being told there that is done quite well.
Yes. Also do love just all the stuff of Alden/Sinbad as the king and him just being like, well, what's the point of it? Like the king can do whatever he wants, right? So it's like, I want to see the limits of my kingly power,
yes.
and that's it. And that's the only thing that matters to him. And I think that's actually like a really great kind of like searing portrayal of absolute monarchy. And like
yes.
that, like in many, that what Alden is doing is so despicable. And he's a dude who I kind of like, you know, I didn't like super early in the movie, and then around the middle of the movie, I'm like, especially when Miriam died, I was like, oh, I kind of like this guy. I'm on his side, and he becomes Sinbad. I'm like, that's cool. I like Sinbad. Sinbad's rad. And then he becomes king. I'm like, oh, this guy's a piece of shit. Oh my god. But when he gives his justification, I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, if you're someone who this is the world in which you have lived and you've been dominated by this system the whole time, there is a brutal honesty to him becoming king and just saying, yeah, fuck it. You guys go do a war over there. You people give me all your money. And you guys, I want you to build a tower so big that it will touch the sun. It's like,
yes.
What are you going to do about it? I'm the king, bitch. Get to it.
Well, and that's also where it interpolates myths from like several different parts of the world.
Yes.
With all of that. And I think having it all be that he's the king and he's just throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks is part of what makes that whole part so fascinating. Yeah, I agree. One other thing I want to stress here, and this is true in Cleopatra as well, is how I think, like, interestingly transnational these films are. Because they adapt stories foreign to Japan, but with a variety of international styles, with a film studio in Nippon Herald that started out distributing foreign films. And I think this is also a trend very true in new wave movements like France's, where there's this irreverence for national forms and identities and a desire to artistically and stylistically kind of collapse them all together. And I think that's cool. I think A Thousand One Nights does it much better than Cleopatra, although there are some of my favorite moments in Cleopatra is when it just becomes very irreverent for like the way it's depicting like nationality and nation's borders and all that stuff. So like, you know, transnational cinema is like a major area of film studies. It's actually one of my claimed areas of expertise because of my comprehensive exams. And if I were to teach a transnational film class, I might have to like sneak this movie in, A Thousand and One Nights, because I think it actually illustrates the ideas very forthrightly in that it is so irreverent to how it uses the idea of national borders, of myths, of like what styles it's going to use, where it's drawing from. And I think that kind of stuff can be really interesting and is also very rooted, I think, in the global culture of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, and it's one of the things of like the advantage this movie has being animated that it can do that.
Yes.
That it gives it this flexibility to depict whatever it wants in whatever moment it wants to depict it. Which again, like if this were a live action movie, one of the live action Pink films, that would just be completely impossible. So it's one of the cool things about this movie is it just gives you something that no other movie is going to give you.
100%.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can also find us over at the Purely Academic Podcast, our potentially educational variety show where we talk video games, movies, TV, and more every month. And you can read my movie reviews and follow everything we release together on the Fade to Lack Substack at www.jonathanlack.com.
And now, back to the show.
All right. Well, do you want to go ahead and move on to our second movie of the day, Sean, and talk about Cleopatra?
Yes, let's discuss the dark middle chapter of this trilogy.
Yes. So 1001 Nights was June 1969. Cleopatra comes out in September of 1970. Cleopatra opens with a title card that is one of the most delightful things I've ever seen, reading, "This story is a fiction, so all responsibility does, lie on the production staff because the character of this story are all fictitious." And that's probably that is one of my two favorite scenes in Cleopatra, is just that title card.
You know that Julius Caesar in this movie? It's not that other Julius Caesar. Trust me, it's Mark Antony, nope, Brutus, nope, this is a different, I know he's both called Brutus, but it's a different one. This Cleopatra lady, I know you think it's that Cleopatra, this is a fictitious Cleopatra.
Were they worried the historical Julius Caesar was going to sue them from 5,000 years beyond the grave?
Whoever the great descendant of the Ptolemaic dynasty is gonna take their fucking the asses to court. It's like, how dare you depict my great grandmother this way?
Anyway, let's talk about the history behind this one, which there's just less to say about because it was the least successful and least acclaimed of the three films. By far the one that's been written and studied about the least. Just go look at the Japanese Wikipedia page for these three. Belladonna and 1001 Nights both have these really detailed pages that you sometimes get with anime. It's threadbare for Cleopatra. I had to go to different places to just learn basic things about this movie. So I think we are not the only ones who would say this is the least of the three. But let's talk about the history just a little bit, because there's a couple things I think it intersects with that is interesting. Yamamoto, in an interview I drew this from the Belladonna of Sadness bonus features from Discotheque. Although I think Yamamoto has interviews on all three of these, because again, he lived until 2021, and while he wasn't working in anime, he continued to talk about it. But in any case, he says he had not been entirely satisfied with 1001 Nights on a production level. He said he felt it became too cluttered due to the deluge of ideas included, and he wanted to step back and not do Cleopatra. It was not something he was necessarily interested in. He thought Tezuka, who kind of, I think, micromanaged a little bit maybe on 1001 Nights, he thought Tezuka should direct it instead. Tezuka insisted, nah, man, you're needed. You made a hit. You're my guy. So they decided ultimately that they would co-direct. So this one is directed by Yamamoto Eiichi and Tezuka Osamu, in one of Tezuka's, honestly, pretty rare, directorial credits from this period, because he usually was more of a producer kind of figure, a la a Walt Disney, in terms of his influence on stuff. But Tezuka drafted the story and drew the storyboards. Yamamoto handled the day-to-day production. And I think you can see that division of labor in the final film, because this is more consistent and at times competent as a production than 1001 Nights. You could tell everything ran more smoothly behind the scenes watching this movie. I think you can also feel that Tezuka was more unfiltered in going to town on the story, because there is more Tezuka visible in this one than in the other two. For instance, in the way that when they get to ancient Egypt, there are just constant anachronisms, and there are pop culture references everywhere, and that kind of, if you read Tezuka's manga, even Dororo, you'll have Dororo turn to the reader and make a fourth wall break and do a little pop culture reference, which Tsugigi Zaburo did not keep in the anime of Dororo, but it's in the manga because Tezuka liked having that kind of little ongoing readership with his, or relationship with his readers. And you can see a lot of that at work in Cleopatra. And sometimes I think those are the most charming moments of the movie. I think you can also feel, though, that this is a very stream of consciousness thing that Tezuka came up with.
Yes.
And that the story is not where the focus was. Is that a fair assessment, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, there is that one point, I forget exactly what prompts it, because it's an insane non sequitur, but there's this one point where it just inserts a second of footage from fucking Astro Boy. And
that's my favorite part. That's one of my favorites. Yeah, it's someone points up and says, someone has to save Cleopatra, and then Astro Boy is flying, which would have been the first color footage of Astro Boy, because we had not gotten to the 1980 cartoon yet. So I think that's kind of funny. There's also when they're building the statues to Julius Caesar as he is becoming a monarch. There's the one that is Julius Caesar with the American soldiers at Iwo Jima raising the flag.
Oh, yes.
That one is fucking nuts. There's stuff that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that whole parade scene when they get to Rome is just chock full of that shit in a way that is in bits and pieces in 1001 Nights does a little bit of that. Belladonna of Sadness kind of does that, but in a totally different way. It has a broadly similar scene, but it's such a different movie that it has a very different effect. Whereas here, it does feel like the movie has this instinct of, I want to insert some jokes. It's I got some gags is what the movie feels like it has for you.
Yeah, so you can tell Tezuka's hand in it very clearly. One notable piece Cleopatra has in history is that it is one of the first 2 animated films, and maybe only 2, released in the United States with an X rating. So remember, just to back up, the late 60s in the United States is also when the traditional studio system collapsed over here, alongside our long-standing production code, which led to the creation of the MPA rating system. The introduction of the X rating, while not yet associated with pornography, did lead to an interest in filmmakers trying to make films about or involving sex and eroticism, possibly even involving real sex. Some early X-rated movies were successes like Midnight Cowboy and Medium Cool, although both of those were later re-rated R, and some mixed art cinema with sex and eroticism like Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris. But for the most part, the X rating was co-opted by pornography because, and I've always loved this piece of history that people don't know because it's so funny, the MPAA did not trademark the X rating. They thought, we'll never need a trademark on that, which means that it's actually sometimes hard to tell what was officially and unofficially rated. We know porn was never officially rated, and they just stole the X rating and later turned it into XXX as a marketing tactic, which led to quickly newspapers, TV stations refusing to advertise X-rated films, even if they were things like Medium Cool that was not porn. And it also meant that studios did not want to release X-rated films and theaters did not want to show them. It's a very funny thing. The introduction of PG-13 and then NC-17 in the 80s and 90s was intended to fix this problem. They did trademark NC-17, so there's not NC-17 porn, but the exact same pattern emerged and it was never really used, so to this day NC-17 is mostly an unused rating, and I think that's all funny. So Tezuka's Cleopatra was released in the US in 1971 through Xanadu Releasing in a deal that was inked in part to help the company Mushi Pro with its many financial woes. It did not help. But it was released alongside Felix the Cat Fritz the Cat, the same year. The Bakshi film, and it was one of the first animated films pitched at an adult audience via the X rating. Fritz the Cat was April 18th, and Cleopatra was April 24th, both in New York. However, Fritz the Cat was officially given to the MPAA for a rating and got an X. Cleopatra, as far as we can tell, the rating was just voluntarily applied. They just put it on the posters, because again, not trademarked, you could just slap an X on there, and it was a marketing tactic. And that marketing tactic very much backfired, because Xanadu went hard with this. They called the movie, and actually I was shocked to discover this is what Letterboxd calls this movie, Cleopatra, Queen of Sex. That is what they called it for its American release. They played it in New York theaters, explicitly advertising it as pornographic, which is why they used the X. And part of why the film flopped in its American release is that it pissed off patrons who expected something, well, more XXX than X. And that is not what Cleopatra is.
Yeah, it's funny because it's like, I feel like it's like sort of the least erotic of the 3 movies. Ironically, like it's it's funny because this is like the only dimension through which I had like been aware of this movie was it being this movie called Cleopatra, Queen of Sex that had an X rating that at some point I had read about it, and so it's like in the back of my head I was like, oh, this one is going to be like the super sexy one or something, and then it's like, no, it's the least sexy of the 3 movies, and none of them are particularly sexy like in that way, that like if you want to get your rocks off, you got to have a kind of peculiar attitude in order for this to be the person that you're going to get your rocks off to these movies. But this one in particular, I think it's just a kind of boring movie, and it doesn't have a lot of sex in it. So if your thing is you just want to get to the sex scenes, there's not many. They're very short. They're not particularly erotically depicted. And so you're going to go through a lot of very dull film to try to get to some very disappointing sex scenes.
You did, however, Sean, just explain how most sex exploitation films work. So yes. I do think Cleopatra feels the most like a sexploitation film, like in that it is dull for long stretches, and the sex is not super satisfying when it gets there, and its most explicit material is through, like, innuendos and conversations about sex, not depictions of it, if that makes sense. Yeah. Like, I will just say, my favorite moment in this fucking movie, because it is so bonkers, is the banana scene, which happens near the end, where Cleopatra has gotten with, who is it?
Mark Antony?
Mark Antony, yes. I almost said Marcus Aurelius. No, Mark Antony. And he's worried that his dick is too small. So she shoves a giant banana in his mouth, and she goes, how did that taste? He said, I couldn't tell. I was choking on it. And then she gives him a small banana, and he goes, that was delicious. And she says, and that's how it works. And I fucking howled with laughter. That is like one of the funniest pieces of like actual like erotic adjacent stuff that they do in these movies, but I think a lot of it is much duller than that. And this one definitely leans more towards, we're going to talk about sex a lot, we're going to do a lot of sexual violence against women, and we're going to have women with their tits out. But it's not clever about it for the most part.
Yeah, and the scene you just described, that's the best scene in the whole movie, because that's the scene where like Cleopatra is most, I think, satisfyingly characterized, and they're like trying to do a relationship here, because I think there's this like idea this movie has of what it's about, which is about a Cleopatra who, you got to put history out of mind because it fucking makes no sense historically speaking. We'll talk a little bit about why, just because I think it's fucking weird, this idea of Cleopatra. But that she's being used by these like Egyptian rebels to try to liberate the Egyptian people, to have her seduce and then assassinate Julius Caesar, and then afterwards seduce and assassinate Mark Antony. But that Cleopatra is just this woman being used in this way, being used as much by her own people as by the Romans. And that she inevitably falls in love with these men she's trying to seduce because she wants something of her own. And then there's this tragedy of she cannot help but lead them to their deaths. And that particularly with Mark Antony, it's like a real love she has, not the Julius Caesar one, which, you know, Julius Caesar kind of just doesn't work out and he's into his original wife. And I think there's like, again, if you put the history of it and the sort of like unsatisfying idea of how you'd portray Cleopatra's side, I think there's a shell of an interesting character-based story there. But the movie just does not know how to get at it. And the only time I think there's like a real authentic scene where you feel those relationships being developed is that one little scene with Cleopatra and Mark Antony, because it's lighter and it feels like these are like human characters that are acting these ways and feeling these ways against historical forces. And that's a cool story. I just wish the rest of the movie could have fucking got around to trying to tell that story, actually.
Yeah, I think I was pulled between wanting the movie to be more kind of narratively invested and sincere, a la what you're pointing to. And the banana scene is an example of it being that thing, where it's like light and cheeky, but also interested in actual themes and characters. I was torn between that and wanting it to be more irreverent. Like, because I think there's the more sincere version of this, and then I think there's also the just be an exploitation movie version of this that I kind of like, if it could also go fully in that direction, because I dig the weird-ass setup of this movie where we start with live-action footage where they are rotoscoping onto the heads of actors in a shitty, like, space set. It basically looks like a shittier version of the set in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, where all the aliens live and do their work.
It's specifically, Jonathan, it looks fucking identical to the set and costuming of the Godzilla movie Invasion of the Astro Monster, which is the second King Ghidorah movie. And which would have been around this time, 1970. I think it was a little bit before this. It looks eerily similar to the set and costuming of that film. Yes. But yes, it is that with these incredibly ugly and unappealing animated heads. Like, it's one of the least appealing images I think I've ever seen in a movie, is everything at the very beginning and the very end with their, like, horrible anime rotoscoped heads on these schlocky people. It's fucking awful.
It's awful, but it is also, like, completely in keeping with all the rotoscope shit from this period where people thought that was the future of animation. It wasn't. It was not. It was not. But anyway, but I kind of dig just the weirdness of this movie. If you don't know, we're talking about a movie called Cleopatra. It's a sci-fi movie that opens in space in the distant future where three, I think, like, non-humans who are humanoid are tasked with going back in time into the, like, astrally projecting into the bodies of people from Cleopatra's time to find out what the Cleopatra plan is, because aliens are threatening them with something that they have picked up through transmissions is called the Cleopatra plan, and so they think the best way to learn what the aliens are up to is to learn about the historical Cleopatra through time travel. And that is all fucking bonkers. You have the three main characters who get into the bodies of a slave, a One of them is just Cleopatra's attendant, but the attendant is like a big like leopard dude, so like an animal. And then I forget what the third one is.
Is like she's like a village girl, like an Egyptian
village girl. Yes. Yeah. So you have those three. And I think like that whole setup is like fairly entertaining. And again, like if you went with like super schlocky based on that, I think that could also be entertaining because there are stretches of this movie I found lively. Like I think when they get to Rome and you have the parade sequence, I think is really good. Like it's completely irreverent. It's just bouncing between style, shot to shot. It's completely insane. Eventually the parade, like it's gradually thinning out the drawings until it's just pencil sketches. There's stuff like that I like. They do Caesar's assassination as basically a bit of no theater, all in this like one long take that is with like the slow singing and everything. And like when it is just completely basically Mad Magazine version of it, I'm into it, but I do think it has this weird push and pull where like the final 15 minutes of this movie felt like 45 minutes to me because it is trying to do this kind of sincere, like tragic death of Cleopatra killing herself with the snake. And I'm just like, what even is this at this point? And there are other parts that just like lost me too. This movie is technically 20 minutes shorter than 1001 Nights. It feels so much longer. It took me, I will just say, it took me 3 separate sittings to get through this thing. And I think part of it is just, I don't really feel like a tonal vision for if they wanted this to be pure schlock, if they wanted it to be something else. And a lot of times I just wish it had picked a lane.
Yeah, because I think the problem is if you are trying to do any of the actual history around Cleopatra, which to their credit, I mean, they do a lot. Like a lot of this is broadly speaking historically accurate. There are like really key things that are not. Obviously, even outside of the sci-fi shit, in terms of their depictions of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and that stuff, there are key things that are like very wrong. But the broad strokes are all, like that's what happened. And I just don't think it's possible to do the story of Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony and also do the irreverent thing at the same time. Like it's just the Cleopatra story is a story of like elaborate slow burn politics between this, like these two different, like big historical factions, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, which was imposed after the death of Alexander the Great by one of his men. And so they're all the Macedonian Greeks that rule Egypt. And then you have the Romans who are obviously expanding, and Julius Caesar who has ambitions to become the dictator, who starts that relationship with Cleopatra. And then Julius Caesar is assassinated. And then she ends up hooking up with Mark Antony, who's one of his main successors, who is in a long, elaborate political competition with multiple individuals, most notably Octavian, who then that eventually Octavian outmaneuvers Mark Antony and Cleopatra to get an excuse to invade Egypt. And then basically Mark Antony and Cleopatra more or less commit double suicide because they're going to die anyways, and Octavian then imposes himself as the emperor god of Rome, Augustus. Like, that's a big, elaborate, complicated story that takes place over the course of, like, 20-plus years of history that is mostly about the complex politics of these two different cultures and people, and these very savvy political figures, Cleopatra, Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian, Sasha de Augustus, and they're, like, big political games. This is a Game of Thrones kind of thing, way more than it is your, like, schlocky mythology, folklore, we can do what we want with it, like 1001 Nights. And so I think you're right, Jonathan, that, like, it needs to pick a lane, but I just don't know how much of the Cleopatra stuff even would make sense in any way, shape, or form if they had even picked the irreverent lane. So it's kind of felt like the movie, from a conceptual standpoint, has kind of totally fucked itself over.
Well, and that's one thing to note, is that this is the only one that is not based on a source material, because the first movie is based on this broad set of mythology, which is a lot of different things, but there's like a book they could pick up and read and all of that. And then the third film is also based on a book that is, they're pulling a small section from, but it is based on an actual, like, again, thing that you could leaf through. This is just based on the idea of Cleopatra. Like, there wasn't like a Tezuka manga for this. There wasn't a specific telling of Cleopatra's life. It's just kind of working with the history. And I do think that makes it extra shapeless, which is that the other two are in some way literary interpolations, and this is not. And I think that's part of why it feels very scattershot. But before we go further, should we talk about the crew?
Yes.
And who made this? So, again, directed by Tezuka and Yamamoto. This is the only Animerama film for which Tezuka has a directing credit. Tezuka also credited with original plan and story. The screenplay, however, was written by Satoyoshi Shigemi. And this is Satoshi's only credit, if you look at Anime News Network or IMDb, and that is because Satoyoshi was by trade a playwright who mainly worked in theater. He was prestigious at this. He worked with the Mirai Theater, or Future Theater Company, in the 50s and 60s, and the Cleopatra job came right as that period of his career was winding down. So, very hard to tell what this dude's role in this even really was, because, again, like, you can feel Tezuka's hand in, I think, a lot of the storytelling, and then I think the idea that this is, again, the only film this person ever wrote, animated or live action, so there isn't a great sense of filmic, like, narrative to it, but also he was a playwright. And I don't really see the playwright skills being drawn on that well either. Like, when we get to the screenwriter for Belladonna of Sadness, you also have a non-traditional hire there, very much. But I think that person, you can see how their skills, and I'll talk about this when we get there, was like very tailor-made for what they wanted from Belladonna of Sadness. This one just feels like they got an interesting writer, but I'm not sure they gave that person a lot to work with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. For character design, we have Kojima Ko. This is his only character design credited in anime. He was mainly a cartoonist, and alongside 1001 Nights designer Yanase Takashi, was one of the principal forces behind the Japan Cartoonists Association. But in his work, he is best known for the series Sennin Buraku, which is also one that has never really traveled to America, but it's very famous in Japan. It ran continuously from 1956 to Kojima's death, and held the record for the longest-running comic by a single artist. And a fun bit of history here, his niece is Ano Moyoko, who is also a mangaka, and also, if you recognize that last name, that is the wife of Ano Hideaki. So, a weird ancestral tie from Cleopatra, Queen of Sex, to Ano, King of Depression. Sorry.
Yeah, that's like, all we need is we just need, like, fucking some Evas in this movie. If we could just get some Evas here and just have them level Egypt, that would be pretty good.
That would definitely fix the movie, but the problem is, Sean, most bad movies would be fixed by the presence of Evangelions. So, or Gundams, or, Vodums, whatever you want to put in there. All right, for art direction, we have Ito Kazue, prolific art director of the period, including on Tomino Yoshiyuki's first solo show, Umi no Triton, which was a Tezuka adaptation. And he also did a lot of later World Masterpiece Theater shows, or adjacent ones like Dog of Flanders, Little Women, the Les Miserables anime. And I think you can see that in the movie. There is kind of a very kind of like Western, like softer, rounder sense to some of the art in this film that I think you can see there. But again, I do just think it's funny that this person was mainly known for things that are not Cleopatra, Queen of Sex in tone. Music is again Tomita Isao, and it does have a few songs that were written by Isao, including Cleopatra's theme, written by Isao with lyrics by Nakayama Chinatsu, who we'll talk about more in a bit, and then Gorilla's song, which was written by Komuro Hitoshi with lyrics by No Kahe, performed by Rakumonsen and Fool Sounds. And I think the music in this one also has some good bits, but overall feels much more scattershot than the music in 1001 Nights.
Yeah, it just kind of feels like, because the movie itself doesn't have a clear tonal identity, there's no way for the music to either. Because like the music itself is good, but it's just like the movie just doesn't have anything to hook into the music with, the way that the music's style was so of a piece of 1001 Nights. And it's a shame because I think the Cleopatra theme is fantastic. I think it's a great song. Yeah. I just wish it could go with a much better Cleopatra movie. Yes. It's like it just does not. It's like it's so powerfully somber that when you have this movie that is doing this sort of dull version of Cleopatra that also is interjected with like random gags and a whole frame narrative of people from the future astrally projecting themselves into Cleopatra's time to fight aliens. The somber, melancholy Cleopatra theme just doesn't get a lot of like space to really exist on its own terms.
Well, and you're so right, and that is such a good example of the film's kind of bipolar nature, right? That you have, when you say the premise of like future people astrally projecting into the past, you want something fun and silly and schlocky. The theme song, though, is this beautiful, earnest story that I think would be for a much more earnest telling of Cleopatra's life. So that just none of it fits. None of it fits. All right, can I talk about the cast? This fucking cast. Fascinating. So fascinating. We just mentioned Nakayama Chinatsu. She voices Cleopatra. And like Aoshima Yukio in Knights, we have a fascinating star here because Nakayama had a limited voice acting career. Most famously, she played Chie in Chie the Brat, the film and TV shows by Takahata Isao. I love that her two main anime roles are Chie the Brat and Cleopatra, Queen of Sex. But she was most famous as a stage and TV actor who later became a writer and a member of the National Diet from 1980 to 1986. That's right, our second politician leading a movie of the day, although she became a politician after this movie was made, which is also plenty weird. She also became a full-time writer, with her 8-volume autobiography being nominated for the Naoki Prize, one of Japan's most prestigious literary awards. Wow, what a career.
And I assume like maybe 6 out of the 8 volumes are about her involvement with this film. I assume that's like the main thing that she wrote about in her autobiography was playing Cleopatra, Queen of Sex.
We'll come back to her. She's also very important to the next film, but we'll get there in a minute. Julius Caesar is voiced by Hana Hajime, who was the leader of the comic jazz band The Crazy Cats and a comedy star in Japan. This is one of only 3 anime credits for him. Marcus Antonius is voiced by Nabe Osami. He was also a Japanese comedian who also worked as a DJ and the host of a jazz cafe. He became very popular in the 60s for a Nippon TV variety show and catapulted to further fame in 1968 with the Shochiku film Onsen Gorilla Otakuki. And I don't know what that movie is, but it was very popular at the time and probably part of why he was hired for this. Then we've got our 3 future people. We've got Maria Fellow, who becomes the Egyptian woman Libya. This was Yoshimura Jitsuko, who was a major actress of the Japanese New Wave. Her first appearance in film was in Imamura Shohei's Pigs and Battleships, which is one of like the key texts of that whole movement. Great film if you've never seen. Have you ever seen Pigs and Battleships, Sean?
No, I've not seen that one.
Oh, so good. So good. Really fascinating movie. She also later starred in Imamura's The Insect Woman, Shindo Kanato's Onibaba, and Kurosawa Akira's Dodescaden. So she was like a major live-action actor, and I think that's fascinating. Then for the character Hal Witcher, who becomes Lupa, the like tiger dude, that is Yanagiya Tsubame, who is a Rakugo artist, the 5th generation performing under that name. They were born Kimura Eijiro. So you've got a full-on Rakugo artist playing that part. And then for Jiro Tani, who voices Ionius, or who becomes Ionius, you have the voice actor Tsukamoto Nobuo, primarily a stage actor and a really prestigious one at that when you look at his list of credits and awards. But he also did some acting in tokusatsu shows in this period, including Ultraman and Kamen Rider. So you've got that guy. Then you've got Calpurnia, voiced by Ime Kazuko. She was also a theater and TV actress whose voice work was mainly in film dubbing. She was the voice for Katharine Hepburn and Sophia Loren. Capagonius, here's a really fascinating one because this is a guy named Abe Susumu. Abe Susumu was an elementary school teacher who retired in 1964 to establish the Creative Education Center and was involved in various educational initiatives for the rest of his life. At the time of Cleopatra, he was also serializing a column in Weekly Shonen Jump where he defended the Nagai Go manga Harenshi Gakuen, which is famous as one of the first ecchi manga, against criticisms from PTA groups, Parents Teachers Association groups. He started doing the next episode preview narrations for the anime adaptation of Harenshi Gakuen the same year as Cleopatra. The bulk of his surviving work is many books he wrote on education, but he did have various small roles in anime and TV series at that time. You can't make this stuff up, Sean. You just can't.
Yeah, it's wild. I mentioned I did look up the guy who plays Ionius and Tsukamoto Nobuo, and the role he was in Ultraman is he's the captain of the team for the first half of Return of Ultraman, which is the third Ultraman show. About halfway after the second core of that show, some of the cast stuff gets switched around. So he leaves as like very mysteriously just sort of disappears from that show, as I recall. They don't really explain it very much. They're just like, oh, he's off on a mission, and then they never talk about him again. But I remember him being good.
For Octavian, we have kind of our only traditional voice actor of the period, and even then it's kind of non-traditional because this is Nozawa Nachi. We've talked about him several times. He was Hyakimaru in Dororo 1969, and very, very good in that show. And he was the first ever voice of Lupin in the Lupin III pilot film. Obviously did not do that role long term, but is the first person to voice Lupin, and was more of a movie dub actor than a anime actor, but this is another anime role he did. For Apollodoria, we have a really famous person. We have Hatsui Kotoe. She was a theater actor who started out in youth theater, moved into TV and film later on, and was famous for playing villains in Nikatsu action movies. In theater, she was known as one of the 3 great-grandmother actresses of the theater world for the way she could kind of throw her voice to be very, like, motherly or elderly, which is almost certainly why she was later cast in her most famous voice role as Dola, the pirate captain and mother in Miyazaki's Laputa, Castle in the Sky, which is honestly one of my favorite, like, Ghibli voice performances ever. So she was great. She died prematurely of stomach cancer in 1990 at the age of 61, and that was met with a big outpouring of grief, particularly in the theater community. She was a beloved performer. And finally, Chief Tarabana is Kato Yoshiro, who is a popular post-war mangaka whose strip Mappira-kun ran from 1954 to 2002 in the Mainichi Shinbun, a daily newspaper. He later did some TV hosting as well and became a popular TV personality. As far as I could tell, this is his only anime role.
Well, that's a totally uneventful and ordinary cast for a movie like this.
Honestly, the most entertainment I got out of Cleopatra, Sean, was looking up and making my notes for the cast. Because that is an incredible cast. I do think the voice acting is very good. Like, it's very lively. It's very different from what you would hear from anime. But the film itself, as we've, I think, already pretty well laid out, there's just not a lot there, sadly.
Yeah. I think with the characters, like, I do think they've got, like, I like their take on Julius Caesar overall. I liked their take on Octavian / Augustus until they made it homophobic at the end, which fucking sucked. But Nozawa Nachi, I thought it was like a cool way to depict him, because you don't want to fuck with Octavian. You know, he's the guy who becomes Augustus Caesar. He installs himself as a god. He rules Rome. He's like the only Roman emperor who gets like a good, long, proper reign. And obviously, you know, Rome is very famous for having a lot of very shitty emperors not so long after Augustus. And so I liked the way they depicted him as this very sort of like initially background figure that then when it comes time for him to put the screws to Cleopatra and Mark Antony, he just, you know, they can't do anything against them. And so I like some of like the conceptualizations of some of those characters and how they're voiced. But obviously, you know, most of the movie does not support that stuff and make it good.
The homophobia at the end around Octavian is like the grossest thing in any of these movies, I think. You know, it's not completely unexpected for a movie of this period, but it is still very unpleasant.
Yeah, especially when it's like, you know, that the explanation of why he can't be seduced by Cleopatra is because he's gay and not because he's not an idiot who's completely full of himself, you know? Like, I just thought it's like, oh, that just makes not only is it homophobic, on top of that, it just makes the character boring, because it doesn't give him like something interesting of why he's different from these other men. You know, and even like, you know, and I'm really grasping at straws, because I watched this whole movie in one sitting. I didn't chicken out like you, Jonathan, and split out. I was like, I got to stick through this fucking thing. And it's like, by the end, I was really grasping at straws of just my love for the period and of this like era of Roman history, to be like, well, you know, at least Octavian's cool. And you know, and I like their like version of why, you know, of him not being able to be seduced. And then it's like, oh no, it's just because he's gay. It's like, okay, great. It's like one of the only things I kind of liked about this movie. Even, you know, he's only in like 3 scenes, but I kind of like the version Octavian, and even that they can't let me have.
Yeah. Like, I think this movie also just, it feels the seediest. It feels like, I said I, you know, kind of wish it went in a more schlock vein just because it would be more fun, but I don't feel like it's often like schlocky. It just feels seedy at times, like, and in a way that I think is very true of sexploitation movies of the period. Yes. But like the whole idea that Cleopatra is initially like ugly and she has to be remade into be beautiful, And part of this is because she's been trained in like the arts of sex to seduce men. And there's the whole scene where they make the guy basically stick his fingers in her and they come out like broken because they're talking about how like tight she is. And it's just stuff like that where a lot of this movie's idea of eroticism, I think, feels gross and mean-spirited in a way I wouldn't say for a lot of 1001 Nights, where that feels a little more, like, definitely casually sexist, but also kind of fun and freewheeling and more kind of the era, in at least the way we think of the era. This feels more the way we've forgotten the era, which is how much of it is just kind of mean in its seediness, and I think you get a lot of that throughout the film.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And on top of that, it's, I think one of my big issues with the movie is just their idea of Cleopatra is so boring. That it's just, she's this incredibly passive figure, this girl who's manipulated on all sides, obviously like being used by the Romans for sex and then being used by her own people to try to kill the Romans. And it's just like, Cleopatra is such an interesting historical figure because she was like a brilliant person. Like, she was a brilliant politician who was, in such a inferior status compared to someone like a Julius Caesar coming from Rome at its height as a republic, right? Obviously at the sort of end of it being a republic, but it's one of its heights as a military power. Julius Caesar has had multiple incredibly successful campaigns against various different, like, very formidable opponents as he's expanded Rome's influence, and he comes to Egypt. And Cleopatra, I think it's like saying this, like, oh, she just used sex to seduce him, is like, I'm sure there's like some part of that is she used what she had to like get his favor, but also it's like she used her political status and her like ingenuity to help her become installed as definitively Egypt's ruler at the time, because she was not when Julius Caesar came in. And so she uses him so she can become the ruler of Egypt, and then they use each other to expand their respective influence. And so like the notion that like she's just being manipulated and that she's somehow party to the assassination of Julius Caesar is just dumb. Like, why would she want to assassinate Caesar? Caesar's her fucking golden ticket that she fought for and won. Like, he's her, like, ride to the, top, basically. That if she's got Julius Caesar as a partner, like, nobody can threaten Egypt and can't threaten its sovereignty as long as Julius Caesar's not interested in taking its sovereignty. Julius Caesar gets assassinated. She then does the exact same thing with Mark Antony and is very successful at it for like 10 years until Octavian eventually comes around and defeats them. It's like just the notion that she is this passive, weak figure that lacks any control or agency in her own life. It's just such a shitty, boring way to depict like one of the most brilliant people from her historical period. That she was in, compared to someone like a Julius Caesar or Mark Antony or Octavian, she's at such a disadvantage on the international stage in her relationships with Rome, and she's able to fight for like such an equal partnership for decades. It's just such a shitty way to depict that person.
I completely agree, and it's extra disappointing when you like think of the different routes they could have gone. Like, I know the filmmakers did not call it Cleopatra, Queen of Sex. The American distributors called it that. But if you're going to have a movie that could be called Cleopatra, Queen of Sex, there is a version where if you wanted to make like a super empowered Cleopatra who's like owning her sexuality and doing crazy things with that might be worthy of a schlocky sexploitation kind of adventure, right? Or you go in the actual like historical direction of someone who is hyper competent and brilliant and like upends as you just said, the world order through ingenuity, effectively. You could do that. And this is neither. This is just, she's just a girl who kind of is kicked around by history. And that, like, through the whole thing, I kept thinking, like, even though you're right that the broad strokes of it are historically accurate, I kept feeling like this has nothing to do with history because it's such a weird portrayal of Cleopatra herself, right? Because I feel like if there's one thing true in any take on Cleopatra you get, it is some version of strength. Even in the kind of sexist interpretation of she's someone who uses her feminine wiles, she is getting one over on the men in that interpretation, right? There's a strength to it. But it's such a weak portrayal, and I think that's exactly what you were putting your finger on and is what makes this feel so off.
Yeah, and it's partial. It's just, on top of all the like kind of sexist stuff and the way that makes the themes of the movie like not kind of fully register, it just also makes the movie boring as shit because your main character just doesn't have much going on. And that's why when you get this like brief relationship with Mark Antony that has a little bit of kind of vitality to it near the end of the movie, you're like, oh, well, there's a character here. I don't know if it's Cleopatra, but there is a character here in our main character of this woman who is being used, but finds this one like relationship. And I think there's something about her like, of like the kind of topsy-turvy relationship of like her. See, you'd think of her being this like much more submissive character compared to a Mark Antony, who's this like general who's won all these campaigns as one of like Caesar's right-hand men. But instead she's so dominant in this like other way, and that's what comes across in the banana scene you talked about. So it's like, that's an interesting scene that depicts an interesting relationship between these two characters. But it's like they had not invested anything in that relationship until the last like 20 minutes of the movie. It boggles the mind why they didn't have stuff with Mark Antony earlier on, because he went with Caesar to Egypt. Cleopatra fucking met him when she met Caesar. So it's like, why wouldn't you start developing that relationship and have this thing of like, she thought that she was using Caesar and was actually being used by Caesar, right? That's like the whole thing in the Caesar relationship. And that like there is this other more like legitimate partnership she has with Mark Antony that she maybe ignored early on and then discovers afterwards. Like there's a like romantic story to be told there outside of its historicity that I wish the movie had pursued, because you see a glimpse of it there and there's like an idea of a plot that they could have actually gone with. But they're so distracted by having random episodes with your weird future dudes doing shit that it's not important. Like that's something that should be stressed, is that whole frame narrative is pointless. It could be completely excised from the movie and you would never even notice it. In fact, that whole thing is so pointless. It feels like it is the kind of thing you would see in a like Gamera Super Monster or Godzilla All Monsters Attack style movie that's like 90% stock footage from previous films in a franchise that you're just reusing. And so you've come up with some we're people who have astrally projected ourselves into the story. And there's 3 scenes in the movie of us talking over like a screen while you see footage of already made movies because we have no money because Daiei is going out of business. Like that's what it feels like. But of course, that's not what it is. That's just, they decided to put this weird frame narrative that's pointless in the film. And because of that, it sucks up a lot of oxygen that could have been used trying to do something with the plot that the movie actually did have.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. It's yeah, I don't know. There's just not much to say about this one, and I think we should probably move on to the movie that is honestly worthy of its own full podcast, but we're gonna give it some time here anyway.
All right, let's talk about Belladonna of Sadness, Jonathan.
All right, Belladonna of Sadness. This film premiered June 27th, 1973 at the Berlin International Film Festival, and then debuted in Japanese theaters 3 days later on June 30th of that year. So, the history of this one, I have a lot written down here because it is fascinating. I will also just say, this is the movie that has, I think, endured most of these 3. Even though there were periods where it was kind of hard to access, it has had a strong reception in like the European countries where it did play on the festival circuit. It's been an underground movie. It's had some scholarship on it. And it has definitely been the one that I think has, especially now that it has been restored and is easy to find, had and is having the most impact, in part because it is the most good of these 3 movies and like the one that I think is most singular and stands outside of this larger history we're talking about. So, but it is technically part of the Animerama thing, because in addition to 1001 Nights and Cleopatra, Nippon Herald Films had also funded an adult-oriented erotic anime film based on the works of gag manga artist Tanioka Yasuji. The film, Do It! Yasuji's Pornorama, was released in 1971. While Nights had been a relative hit and Cleopatra underperformed, Yasuji's Pornorama proved truly controversial. It went through multiple rounds of cuts with Eirin, which is the like equivalent in Japan of the Motion Picture Association Ratings Board, and it was pulled from theaters after a week after threats from Tokyo police. It was thought lost for decades until the rediscovery of the negative in the early 2000s, which was screened at a festival in 2004 and has made some rounds since as kind of a cult film. I have not seen it myself. It has never gotten an official release over here. But this was part of Nippon Herald's plan to have an adult anime in theaters at least once a year. And they had kept that up in 69, 70, and then 71 with the Yasuji film. And they had commissioned a third film from Mushi Pro, the movie that would become Belladonna of Sadness, with the intention that it would continue that annual release with 1972. Now, at the time, Tezuka already had a foot out the door at Mushi Pro. This was true even during the production of the last two films, because he had started a second company, Tezuka Productions, which delivered its first TV series, an adaptation of his manga Marvelous Melmo, in late 1971. So by the time of Belladonna of Sadness, he was effectively gone from normal operations at Mushi Pro and had no involvement in this film's conception or production. Yamamoto said he wanted to depict humans more profoundly with their third film. He and his team were also inspired by the Beatles' Yellow Submarine movie, which would have come out in the late 60s and had done well in Japan. If you've ever seen Yellow Submarine, you'll know that it is like a very of the period experiment, like with animation. And it's this very kind of pop art, almost Andy Warhol inspired use of, I would say, limited animation techniques, although very modernist in kind of that sense. And they really wanted to make something at Mushi Pro, Yamamoto, that could sort of challenge that and would have that kind of like different style of artistry. Because while 1001 Nights and Cleopatra are experimental, they're not completely outside the box in the way a Yellow Submarine or certainly Belladonna of Sadness would be. So I would say they definitely rose to that occasion and more, even though it is very funny to put up the movie Belladonna of Sadness next to Yellow Submarine in any other context, because one is kid-friendly, one is not. And it's Yellow Submarine, not good for kids. Belladonna of Sadness, though, show it to your 5-year-old.
Those blue meanies, they'll give you fucking nightmares, man.
Yeah, that is a joke. Please do not show Belladonna of Sadness to your children. It will scar them. Belladonna of Sadness is based on the 1862 novel La Sorcière by Jules Michelet, published in English as Satanism and Witchcraft. The book is a history of witchcraft, and while it is now believed to be mostly inaccurate in its history, its argument that medieval witchcraft was a form of class rebellion against the feudal system and the Catholic Church makes it one of the earliest texts on the subject that repositions the history to be sympathetic towards women and towards peasants. And that is certainly something that you will see in the film as well. Interestingly, this book was also adapted by the French novelist and director Alain Robbe-Grillet 1 year later in 1974 as Successive Slidings of Pleasure. That film includes the first appearances of Jean-Louis Trintignant and Isabelle Huppert on film. Otherwise, I could not find out anything about it. But it's kind of ironic that it's the same year, even though this book is from 1862, so over a century old at this time.
Although, like, it sort of makes sense just in that, like, that 70s is like, I mean, like, this is such a kind of common theme in so many kind of exploitation or exploitation adjacent movies of Satanism, witchcraft, and that being the sort of voice for those who do not have voices. It's just like, that's what the whole fucking nun thing is with like erotic nuns, right? Like that's just that whole genre. So in that sense, it sort of makes sense. It is weirdly specific though.
Yes. So a note on the film's title. In Japanese, the film is Kanashimi no Belladonna, which is just Belladonna of Sadness. It's a very literal translation, to the point where I think that translation actually sounds a little clunky when you just say it in English, but that is a literal translation. The title card, however, that is in the film also gives the title La Sorcière written in the Roman alphabet a la the novel. So it kind of looks like the intention is that the Japanese title was Kanashimi no Belladonna, but that it would be referred to in English as La Sorcière. However, it has mostly been released in English as Belladonna of Sadness, though sometimes it is referred to as Tragedy of Belladonna. That is what the Mushi Pro official website in Japan calls it for its English title, which is kind of interesting. So an early decision that Yamamoto made on this film was, and it's obvious in the finished film, was to change the production process.
Yeah.
Part of that was to facilitate the style of this film's art director, Fukai Kuni, who we'll talk about in a minute. But it's also the fact that 1001 Nights and Cleopatra were very long, very technically elaborate films. They required a huge amount of outsourcing, made it very difficult to maintain a unified sense of style, and that frustrated Yamamoto. So for Belladonna, he decided decided they would work with a smaller staff over a longer period of time. Yamamoto says the strategy was to have 10 people working for 10 months instead of 100 people crunching in the final month of production. Although he says 10 months, they went way over their initial deadlines. We'll talk about that in a second. There is no lip syncing anywhere in this movie. In addition to there's obviously a lot of still imagery, and we'll talk about that, but this was also a practical choice. Yamamoto also, in thinking about what they would and wouldn't animate, he wanted to put the effort into other kinds of expression and emotionality rather than speaking, because it's a simple part of anime, but it is a big part of the labor is just drawing the lip flaps and getting that all right. And he said, okay, let's do 0 of that. And let's put all of that, because there is a lot of animation in Belladonna of Sadness in key moments, but it is completely different than when you would see animated in other anime, right? And so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that was also part of his strategy. So the first deadline for delivering the film was February 1972. The team completely missed that deadline. They came up with a creative solution to the problem, though, and I fucking love this story. It would give them time to complete their ambitions without pissing off Nippon Herald too much. They created a separate, even smaller production team to fill in the unfinished sections of the film with rushed versions of animation. This version of the film was delivered to Nippon Herald in August of 1972. It is now known as the dummy delivery version of the film. Back at Mushi Pro, the main team continued production, claiming, hey, we made the movie, but we need to do some retakes. We need to do some reshoots. And they took the parts that the B team had made and then spent the extra time polishing those up to make it look nice and finished. And that version was then delivered to Nippon Herald at the end of the year. So they bought themselves about 4 more months with this weird trick. That dummy version has never been publicly released. I would be very fascinated to see it. I'm curious if it even exists anymore. But this actually starts off a part of this section where we need to talk about the 5 or 6 existing versions or non-existing versions of Belladonna of Sadness. So the film was then previewed after its delivery to Nippon Herald in early 1973. This version, which is known as the first preview version, included a 5-minute live-action interlude after the scene where Jean and the devil make their pact in the mountains. This section was filmed by globally acclaimed photographer Moriyama Daido, who has a very long Japanese Wikipedia page, and it would have had some post-processing in a kind of experimental style by the animation team at Mushi Pro. It was presented apparently as a sort of intermission between the film's halves. I assume it went after the sex scene where Jean and the devil sort of combine, and then it becomes this explosion of pop culture detritus, sort of, because the movie does have kind of a fade to black there, and that is roughly the halfway point of the movie. But this interlude would have been largely unrelated and kind of just an experimental gesture. It is not known to publicly exist anymore. The Japanese Wikipedia says that the Japanese DVD's liner notes, which I do not have, so I have not seen for myself, it says those liner notes claim there is an existing English subtitled print with the live-action footage intact, but it is not publicly available. You can't go find this, although I wish it was out there somewhere, because I would be really fascinated to know what the intent was. But that is the first preview version. The film then premiered officially in competition at the Berlin Film Festival on June 27th, 1973. And this is also just something worth noting, is that Yamamoto and team did intend this to be more of an art film. They did intend this to play not sort of on the pink film circuit, but on the kind of international art film circuit. We'll talk about why that kind of failed later on, because basically Mushi Pro's bankruptcy and weird choices in the marketing kind of cut it off at the knees, but premiering it at Berlin, this is very clearly their intent. So this version removed the live-action interlude, and it ended with a shot of the devil character laughing into the camera. That is known as Theatrical Release Version 1. Due to reaction at the festival, which was mixed, there were definitely positive reactions. It did not win the main award of the festival that year, but it was more positively received than is sometimes said in the history. But Yamamoto, based on how he observed the audience, decided to change the ending, and he removed the cut of the devil laughing and instead ended with a shot of Jean being burned at the stake, where the theme song would then come in and play over a black screen. That is known as Theatrical Release Version 2. But since the domestic Japanese release was only 3 days after Berlin, the two versions would have overlapped in their Japanese release, because Yamamoto had to physically make it back from Berlin to Tokyo to make the changes and swap it out at theaters. So these both played to audiences. Speaking of that release, back in Japan, the movie opened at 4 theaters, but all 4 of those theaters were ones that were mainly used to exhibit American B movies. Yamamoto visited the theaters and saw, to his horror, that the film was being advertised on the marquee and on posters as being from the creator of Mighty Atom. So, 2 strikes already. It's at the wrong kind of theater, and it's got the very wrong marketing expectation. Because if you go to a B movie theater and you see, it's from the creator of Astro Boy, you are not expecting the avant-garde delights of Belladonna of Sadness.
Yeah.
So Yamamoto kind of knew the film was fucked from that moment, because the movie was actually supposed to open in the Miyukiza Theater, which is where Yellow Submarine had played and provided them some inspiration. They wanted to make a movie that could play not just at the Miyukiza Theater, but that would be the kind of place they wanted this movie to play, and it never opened there, which added to Yamamoto's frustration. So the movie bombed in its initial release. Mushi Pro goes goes into bankruptcy. It does not get to have the big international release I think they wanted it to, but it did have some cult popularity, particularly among female college students. So in 1979, it was reopened in Japanese theaters, and for that version, Yamamoto chose to remove 8 minutes of the most extreme footage, either stylistically or in terms of sexual content, to aim at that audience of, again, mainly like female young adult college students. He made another revision to the ending here, which I think you can understand in the context of he was putting it towards more of like a university audience, because this is where he adds the ending that we have now, which is where he adds explanatory captions, sort of making a connection between the genre of this story and the French Revolution, and then it ends with the Eugene Delacroix painting Liberty Leading the People, which is from 1830. It depicts a bare-breasted goddess of liberty, Marianne, holding aloft the revolutionary flag and leading men over the barricades. Though, like a lot of people, Yamamoto had misidentified that painting as being about the 1789 French Revolution. It is actually about the July Revolution of 1830 that deposed King Charles X. In any case, this version of the film is theatrical release version 3. The film was then released to home video a year after that re-release on VHS in 1980. It used that theatrical release version 3. So the film was re-released in 1986 for VHS and Laserdisc, and for this version, Yamamoto did do a restoration effort to reinsert the removed material to conform closer to theatrical release version 2. And that has been effectively the editorial basis for future releases, though not always the video basis. So that is where the story sort of ends in Japan, but then there was a major restoration undertaken in the United States by Cinelicious Pictures, and that was released in 2016. They went to restore the movie, and when they got the negative from Japan, so the actual camera negative, they realized that the 8 minutes that had been cut out for theatrical release version 3 were actually cut from the negative itself. So there were tape splices throughout the movie, because those cuts were not made to one section. Every reel had major splices. So they went on a search for the best quality surviving materials of those removed 8 minutes. And it turns out there was one surviving 35mm release print of the full-length cut that had been preserved at the Cinematheque in Belgium. So they were able to get that print, do 4K scans of the negative and that print, and then they were able to reconstruct using the negative for everything they could, and then the 35mm print for anything that was missing. This cut is mostly conformed to theatrical release version 2, but does have the revised ending of version 3, with the captions and the Delacroix painting as the final shot. I have not seen it stated plainly, the reasoning behind that choice, but in the interview with Yamamoto on the 4K disc, he talks about the sort of evolving nature of the ending in a way that makes me think that was his decision. Like, he expresses a personal disdain for the first ending with the devil laugh. And he was alive until 2021. So this interview was given for 2016. I would assume he was consulted and that ending represents his desires. Otherwise, it would be weird for them to have kept it that way. Mm-hmm. This version screened at festivals around the world and theatrically in 2016, was subsequently issued on Blu-ray by Cinelicious. Discotheque later picked up the rights and re-released this version on 4K Blu-ray in 2024, which is the version we watched. And it is, I'll just say right up front, like a heroic restoration. It looks phenomenal. The material from the negative is just excellent. Like, it's a very good scan. The HDR pass that is on there is perfect. Like, just a very restrained kind of pass, but it gives you the right kinds of luminance between like bright and dark areas of the screen. You can definitely tell when they are pulling footage from the 35mm print, because prints are not meant to be used for this sort of purpose. They just have less visual detail that you can get out for a deep scan that you would do for this kind of restoration. But it looks as nice as I think it could, and it is much better to have those 8 minutes than to not have those 8 minutes. And so we're very lucky that the film survives in this quality, and that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting with like the ending stuff, because it is like, if I have one criticism of the movie, it's that I do think like the ending doesn't like really feel quite right, but the other described endings don't sound like they would feel right either. Like, I find it very interesting that there is this sort of waffling on exactly how does this movie end, in terms of like, what do you do for the catharsis after burning Jean at the stake? Because I think the movie desires catharsis. I don't know if the like, let's show a picture of the Bastille with or the painting of the Bastille with the women, and then the Liberty painting, I don't know if that's really the right way to do it. Probably the right way to do it would have involved too much additional animation and footage. That would not have been possible at that point. But it is like the only kind of sticking point in the movie. So it's interesting to see the production history on like, how did that end up happening?
I think it sounds like probably the best ending you could ask for overall of the ones available, because I think that, and you can also tell why Yamamoto did it for the 79 release, because he's thinking about an audience of college-aged women who were interested in the movie. And what the movie does, if you haven't seen it, in its ending is Jean gets burned, and then it is this scene where her face becomes the faces of all the other women in the crowd, and then is this caption about extending that idea through history. It's fairly didactic, but I also do understand it in that context of trying to... It feels like Yamamoto kind of trying to grapple with why was this movie popular with this audience, and create an ending aimed at them, probably because he wasn't satisfied with his own endings from before, and so he's creating it kind of in conversation with his audience. And I find that compelling, and I think that's interesting. I do wish, and I wonder how hard this would be, to have the multiple cuts like represented on video, because if they had the negative and they had that print, I imagine you could reconstruct at least theatrical version 2. I think version 1 might not exist, but I would be interested if you could show the two different cuts at all. That would be interesting to me, so we could compare them directly. But it's the kind of thing where I think the intent of it is interesting and feels correct. The execution, like having to bring in text specifically, feels like too didactic to me, and on the nose. But again, as you said, he couldn't like bring the band back together and do another 5 minutes of animation at the end. That was not on the table in 1979.
Yeah, but I do think there is an instinct in the movie to want to have an uplift at the end, because I mean, well, presumably the sequences of all the women in the crowd getting Jean's face, presumably that was just in the original version of the movie regardless, right?
I'm not sure. That was one I couldn't quite make out.
Yeah, because if that would have been there with the other two endings, it would have had some amount of uplift. But I do just think like the movie wants to have something at the ending that gives you the sense of like that there is a bigger purpose to these things that have happened. And I felt that coming into the ending before I knew that it was going to have this whole French Revolution thing. So it's like I did feel this instinct towards like that Jean can only do so much in the life that she has, but there is this power that will extend beyond her life, and that's part of the Satan connection in some ways. But there's something more fundamental that this like speaks to. It just feels like, particularly for how experimental the movie is in its mode, that it resorting to showing paintings with text on top of it is so flatly conventional that it's such a disappointing kind of swerve, even if I do think that message is the right message. I just wish you could have like exploded through history to see it happen in animation or something, just like briefly, or have like a more direct hint of it in the way they had that explosion of culture produced through the fusion of the devil and Jean in their sexual union in the middle of the movie. Like, that kind of depiction would have been much better. But again, like, that was not possible. On like them considering redoing the ending at that point, they would not have been able to do that.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the crew for this movie, because some really interesting people. Again, we've got Yamamoto Eiichi directing. This time he also has the planning credit, which is the credit Tezuka had on the other two films. So this is his movie in a way that the other two were not. In terms of screenplay, we've got Fukuda Yoshiyuki. And it should be no surprise at this point, but Fukuda was a big theater guy. He's a playwright who served for a time as the JTAA director, that's the Japanese Theater Arts Association. And interestingly, given the plot of Belladonna, one of his most recent plays at the time was 1969's Legend of the Witch, about the Kotoku incident of 1910, which is one of 4 attempts on the life of Emperor Meiji and or his family, which led to the first high-profile prosecutions of the relatively recently adopted criminal codes for high treason. So he had just written something that, I mean, I can't find much more about that play online, but clearly mixing kind of a witchcraft angle in the title with a history of rebellion and uprising and that kind of thing. Belladonna is one of 4 films that Fukuda wrote. The others very much fit into a Japanese New Wave paradigm. He also wrote the 1965 Shinoda film Samurai Spy and the 1970 ATG production Evil Spirits of Japan, directed by Kuroki Kazuo. Yamamoto's direction to Fukuda was, this is porn, but make it a pure love story, which I think is a hilarious description of the final movie, because I don't think it's porn, but I also don't think it's a pure love story. Yes. But we'll get there. Fukuda was much more heavily involved in TV after his theater career, where he became a prolific drama writer, although he also occasionally acted. He appears in 3 episodes of Ultraman, Sean, from the original show, episodes 19 and 22, and from Ultra 7, episode 12. So, the writer of Belladonna of Sadness showed up 3 times on Ultraman, and that is a weird historical fact.
That is a very weird, specific historical fact. I wish I had an encyclopedic level of memory to tell you exactly what happens in episode 19 and 22 of Ultraman and episode 12 of Ultra 7. But those are both very good Ultraman shows, so I'm sure they were good episodes, and I bet he did a good job.
The art director for Belladonna of Sadness, which is a more important position than in most animated movies, yes, given what this movie is a guy named Fukai Kuni. He is a painter and illustrator who has since had some prominence in the art world with multiple solo exhibitions. Lest it go unsaid, most of what you see in Belladonna are still images that we are panning over. More accurately, they're sliding the image under the camera, yes, but creates the impression of a pan or a tracking shot. And so most of what we're looking at is Fukai's handiwork, drawing from inspirations like Egon Schiele, Gustav Klimt, Hieronymus Bosch, Pamela Coleman-Smith's Writer Tarot Deck, and in sort of the stylistically discordant segment we've described already with the pop culture explosion, Peter Max. Fukai was not used to working in a team. He mainly worked alone. This is, again, not an anime guy. And so he wanted to do all this work himself, and Yamamoto, rather than kind of trying to fit the square peg into the round hole, rebuilt the hole and adjusted the production methods to fit Fukai's style and working methods so that they could kind of work around him and have this sort of artistically pure representation of that artwork rather than trying to kind of sand it down on the edges. And I think that was a very smart choice given the movie we got. This is really fascinating to me, Sean. Just last year, in 2024, a project was launched in Japan to restore Fukai's original Belladonna artwork using the 4K film scans and then produce an art book from the material. It was crowdfunded in September 2024 and reached its goal of 3 million yen in 4 days. Rewards included such rarities as original drawings and reproductions. Apparently, with Fukai's involvement, Fukai is still alive as of this recording, at the ripe old age of 90, and I like that he's getting a reassessment here based on his art in this film, because it is some of the most singular artwork ever made for a movie.
Yes, I mean, yeah, obviously the work sort of, stands for itself in
yes,
terms of how striking and how beautiful it is. And it's like the movie exists on the back of that work more so than any other animated film you are likely to see. Like, that is what the movie is. Because as I say, so much of it is still images. So much of it is his work just laid bare with, just little camera things they do to make the image move from a camera perspective, not from an animation perspective.
Yeah. But we do have an animation director on this movie because, and I'm unclear exactly what the role was. Was it just for the parts that move, or was it also considering some of the camera work and whatnot? I'm not sure. Although there is a lot, again, like saying this movie is all still images would be wrong. There's some really striking animation in it as well. And the animation director was the man, the myth, the legend, Sugi Gizaburo, doing fantastic work here at the end of the Mushi Pro days.
Yeah, and again, based on the interview that you linked to me, Jonathan, like he specifically points out in terms of what he did, not necessarily just like the director thing, because obviously he also did animation, but like the part that he focused on and did a lot of personal work on was the Black Death segment of the movie, where there's this, just amazing, big, elaborate artistic representation of the idea of what the Black Death was and what it did, and like the way that like the buildings melt and all the shit. It's fucking great.
It's so good.
Sugi Gizaburo, turns out, he was a hell of an animator. he did some good stuff.
Did some good stuff, had a real attitude about him, and I love it. All right, and then for music, this one is not Isao. This one is Sato Masahiko, who was a prolific jazz musician and jazz pianist. He recorded dozens and dozens of albums. His discography is huge, and he performed all around the world. Funnily enough, and this is so weird, one of his only other anime credits is for the adorable Takahata Isao film Panda Go Panda. So the guy who did Belladonna of Sadness also did Panda Go Panda. And that is almost as funny as remembering that Grave of the Fireflies and My Neighbor Totoro were a double feature.
Do the pandas get burned at the stake in Panda Go Panda?
And then they show the pandas of today rising up in Beijing.
Yeah, they just show like a panda in a zoo. It's just like, here's just a picture of a panda. He's chilling. He's having a good time.
All right. But the other thing about Sato is that he was married at the time to Nakayama Chinatsu, who we talked about. She was the star of Cleopatra and a later on politician. And Nakayama Chinatsu is one of, I think, the most prominent voices in Belladonna because she is the narrator, but she also performs the songs. And so this movie is kind of narrated through both song and through voice. And so Nakayama is one of the main voices here. Yamamoto says they specifically reached out to Sato through Nakayama, having known her from Cleopatra, and without that connection, they probably wouldn't have gotten him. But he is so key to this movie. I think you put him and Nakayama together, and they are kind of the sonic texture of this movie is so important. And it does have that kind of prog rock opera quality to it, where I feel like I don't know what the album for this movie looks like. I want to go find it because the music is incredible. But it does have that thing where you could listen to it and kind of hear the story. And it does have this strong music and animation relationship. So very just serendipitous that this is how it all worked out.
Yes, because it is I think one of the few movies that you can draw a parallel to this. It's not a purely animated movie, but Pink Floyd's The Wall, which has animation as a prominent feature in it. There's a certain essence of that in this that I think share in common. Again, there's just this that concept album piece. This is not all music. It's not a musical or whatever. But there is enough music, and the music is a very load-bearing pillar of the movie in terms of the narrative, not just as tone. If you removed the music from the movie, the story would not make sense anymore because it wouldn't be communicated to the audience. And so in that respect, it is just such a vital part of the overall film because it is very restricted in terms of the typical tools you think of an animated movie doing, because it is not doing long, elaborate conversations. It's not, there's no lip flaps at all. The movie relies so much on this pure audio-visual experience that audio being so good is really essential.
Yeah. And I think you could call this movie a musical in the same way a lot of, and this is a weird connection, but it's there, a lot of early Disney, the way they do it.
Sure.
Bambi or Dumbo is kind of like this even, where it's not necessarily the character singing. You have maybe one or two of those, but there's a lot of just song over the movie narrating the passage of seasons or something. And so I think it is interesting. And the Wall connection is spot on because the Wall, its animated sequences are to do expressive things like show what war feels like without depicting actual war. And that's what this movie does with sex and sexual assault and the Black Death and the way it does the orgy scenes. There's definitely an affinity there. Yeah. I think that would make an interesting double feature, a grueling double feature, but you could do that in a class or something and learn a lot, I think, putting these two movies together. But before we talk about the film itself, let's finally go through the cast. This movie has a relatively small cast because there's not too many characters in it. But let's go through them here because, wow, what a fascinating assemblage of actors we have here. We already mentioned Miss Nakayama Chinatsu as the narrator, and so we have her. For Jean, we have Nagayama Aiko. She is the first star in one of these movies who was not a Japanese politician at any point in her life. From what I can tell, this is her only voice role. She was mainly an actress in TV dramas and a personality on some, like, I guess what we would call today reality shows or
a variety show.
Yeah. But great performance. You have the Lord and the Lady characters. The Lord, who looks like the devil, frankly, he's got this like skull face, is Takahashi Masaya. He was a prolific actor and director on the stage who won the 1996 Yomiuri Theater Award and the 2004 Japan Movie Critics Award for Best Supporting Actor. Again, the Mushi Pro team could not resist their cultured multi-hyphenates. This is his only anime role, although he did do voiceover work for dubs of foreign films, including as Laurence Olivier, which, having seen the film now, I can very much hear that. He's got that booming Shakespearean voice. And then Lady is voiced by Shigako Shimegi. She's a stage actor with the Bungakuza Theater Company. She was active in movies and TV in the 60s and early 70s, but retired not long after this film. Her only voice role was made. One of her final credits is in the movie Zatoichi at Large, the 23rd film in the Zatoichi series.
I have to say, I appreciate you giving me little nuggets. Here's some Ultraman. It's almost as if I put these together.
I know.
These would be the notes I would make if I was crediting these people.
It's just, they always sticked out. Then you've got the priest character, who is voiced by Yonakura Masakane, who was an actor, a stage director, an illustrator, including of picture books. He was very prolific, one of the leading figures in the Gekidan Minge Theater Company, and this is his only anime role. And last, but certainly not fucking least, oh boy, as the devil, we have Nakadai Tatsuya. And yes, it is that Nakadai Tatsuya. I double-checked because it blew my mind. This is the screen legend, I would say second only to Mifune Toshiro in leading man status. I think that is safe to say. Also a frequent collaborator with Kurosawa, but also every other director of the period. I started listing and then I went, it's Nakadai. I can't start listing because it's just all of Japanese cinema at a certain point, and the dude is still alive and kicking at now. He's like 92 or something. I mean, one of my favorite actors of all time, and I think the performance he gives here is like one of the best voice performances I've ever heard in an anime. It's next level, otherworldly, unbelievable shit.
Yeah, I mean, it's like just like this movie's version of the devil is like one of the best versions of the devil in a movie ever. Like, it's so good.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is Nakadai's voice performance adds so much. And one thing I love, because I knew that he was in the movie. This is like one of the only things I've known about Belladonna of Sadness for a while is like, oh, what the fuck? Nakadai Tatsuya is in this movie that as a voice role. Like, that's fucking weird. But it's like, it's weird in the sense that you just don't broadly expect it. But for like a film actor, like his voice is so distinctive and he's got this really powerful, deep, gruff voice, particularly in like movies that call for it, like a Harakiri or something like that, where the voice just so much, because that character in that movie is so restrained physically that he carries so much with his voice. So it's like, in that regard, I'm like, well, yes, and for a film actor, if you're going to have a film actor do VA, like, it's going to be this dude. Like, it's so, his voice is so good. The thing I was really shocked at, though, is early in the movie when it's just like the little tiny devil before he becomes erect, because they're not trying to be subtle with the phallic imagery with the devil at all. He is quite literally a dickhead in this movie. But when he's little tiny, like, Nakadai is doing like a kind of cartoonish voice. Like, he's not just, you would never tell that it's him in the first like 15 to 20 minutes of the movie. It's only once you get to the midpoint and the devil has become fully erect effectually that he's now using much more recognizably what you'd hear, like the kind of voice you'd hear in his other movies. And I just thought that's like, man, he was fucking committed to the role, because there's a sense you get that like, oh, maybe they just cast him because, even in 1973, he was already the star of like so many huge movies in Japan, let alone he's going to go on to be in a shit ton of other really great movies as the lead. That like, we get him in there, he does a couple of lines, and he just does the Nakadai Tatsuya voice, and, you get that name on there. And that's kind of what I more or less expected. It's the most prominent voice role outside of the narrator. And he's fucking committed. Like, he does a whole thing, and his voice changes dramatically throughout the movie as the devil itself changes. And that's like one of the pleasures of this film, is that you just get a full-throated, proper Nakadai Tatsu performance. It just happens to be his voice, not his full physicality, but it feels like he understands what that voice work entails, and he's giving like a voice actor-like performance to the character at a really high level, and that's fucking crazy. It just speaks to his tremendous talent, because I've seen lots and lots of movies, Japanese or otherwise, that have very, very skilled TV film actors doing voiceover roles. And some of them do okay jobs, some of them do bad jobs, but almost none of them do like a home run, this is just a killer voice performance. And he absolutely gave a killer voice performance in this movie.
Like, I think in any study of Nakadai Tatsuya, this needs to be included. Like, this is... You need to put this up next to The Human Condition and Harakiri and Ron and whatever else you want to do. So again, you start listing, you're never going to stop listing with this guy. But, I mean, one of the things I've always loved about Nakadai is that when you compare him to, like, Mifune, because I think that's the easiest comparison because of when they were stars and everything and who they worked with. But, like, Mifune is a fucking bull in a china shop who comes in as a force of nature and is just unmistakable. And Nakadai is kind of a chameleon. Like, he plays the villain in both Yojimbo and Sanjuro and is kind of unrecognizable between the two. And he could really just sink into a role. You think of, like, Ron, you cannot tell that's him physically because he's so made up and he's got, like, the mask-like face and everything. And, like, he kind of brings that whole weight to bear in this through the way, as you said, when you have the Flaccid Devil, is this little, like, imp voice. And then it's not just one transformation, it's a series of transformations that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And, oh man, it's a hell of a performance. So I was like buzzing from like listening to this work and being like, oh my God, I can't wait to talk about this. But I honestly felt that about the whole film, because I think this movie, like, I think it's effectively a masterpiece. I think it's incredible. Mm-hmm. It's one of the two most experimental works of nominally commercial anime I've seen in terms of features. I think the other would be probably Takahata Isao's Tale of the Princess Kaguya in terms of like upending formal expectations of what anime looks like and going back to kind of a baseline of like, well, what is the root of animation, and kind of turning that into the movie. But this is even more radical than Kaguya Hime, because that movie still has a lot of motion in it. This movie does not. This movie has primarily these, you have still images, and most of them are kind of tableaus. You have a lot of like long tracking shots over, like, I do kind of technically wonder how they did some of it, because those drawings, some of them they must have been meters and meters long. And you would have had to be, like, when Fantasia did this in its final sequence with the Ave Maria sequence, which is like the longest tracking shot ever in a Disney movie, they had to take the entire painting out to the parking lot and shoot it there because they couldn't fit it in the studio. Now, I think for Disney, there was an extra difficulty in that that's using a multi-plane process, and these are flat images. So it's probably easier to do on a traditional animation stand. But still, some of that is incredible. There's obviously also vertical pans that we have throughout the movie. So very rarely are we looking at truly a still image. The image is being moved in some way. And that is, like, if you wanted to say what is, like, the foremost, like, thing behind limited animation, particularly as it developed in Japan under Tezuka, it's that. It's making a still image and then moving it to create the illusion of movement. And that is still the thing that even in the most luxurious of animations you'll see today in Japan will still do that, because it's just a stylistic thing that has become part of the language of anime. But this movie makes it the central, like, part of its language is still images that are moved before us, and our eyes are guided across it. And the images are so bespoke, they are so detailed, they're all done in watercolor, so it's got this splotchy, unpredictable quality to it. Characters obviously change a lot in how they look to us from frame to frame, or from drawing to drawing, I should say. As a piece of artwork, it is utterly breathtaking, and that's before you get to, I think, the way it's using that art to tell the story, which I think is also worthy of lots and lots of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's one of the things it made me think about, because I think you're right. This is like the, like, apotheosis of limited animation in some ways, in the sense that it's like it's taking the sort of like stylistic qualities of that and pushing it to its absolute limits, because one of the things some of those limited animation techniques enable is for you to use incredibly detailed, really gorgeous artwork that you would not be able to animate in that traditional sense, right? In when you think about like your kind of old school watching an animated show, and there's like a character on the edge of a cliff, and the cliff side's going to collapse, and you can see where the cliff is because it's super detailed, and the edge of the cliff that's going to crumble is like this super like, you know, flat looking.
Yes.
It's not particularly shaded, right? You think of like that where you can tell what is the background or what is something that is meant to be still, and then what is something designed to be moved, because the thing designed to move is going to be simplified. Well, like the other king of limited animation, particularly in the TV space, is Tezuka Osamu. We have not yet done a season on, but obviously we talked about him with Dororo. We've talked about him with the Lupin III Lady Liberty movie, whatever the full title of that movie was. And obviously he did The Rose of Versailles and Dear Brother and Aim for the Top and all this stuff. And one of the big things with Tezuka Osamu is he has that the postcard moment idea of like these like key signature moments of heightened drama and potency of the story being represented with a very highly detailed still image that is then either panned over, or there are effects like lens effects that are on top of it, like shining a light from off camera that creates a lens flare in the camera using to shoot the picture, right? And like that's one of the hallmarks of Tezuka Osamu's style, is using really limited animation to its absolute height, because you get the most sort of like gorgeous artwork that you then bring some little bit of animation to through camera effects, and then that gives you a saved budget for when you need to do the actual, like, I want a character moving in this shot and I want the character to be animated, that it can allow for really gorgeous, beautiful animation, because you're spending your focus and your energy in the most efficient way possible. And like obviously with Tezuka Osamu, because he's much more of a TV director, that has like different kinds of advantages. With Belladonna of Sadness, I feel like it's taking that idea, it's using it to enable a really singular artist with a really singular and unique style in the art director here. But also because it's a film, that energy is spent on so much energy on what is a relatively smaller amount of time, because it's like an 80-something minute long movie. It's the shortest of these three. And so you do get beautiful art that uses that limited animation technique, but then when things move, the way things move is just as beautiful. Like at the ending of the movie, when Jean is put to the stake and set to fire, and her hair goes up and turns into the flames and all of that, when it does animate, like that's just some of the most gorgeous looking animation you've ever seen. And I think that's just one of the real pleasures of this film, is seeing something that looks unlike any other animated movie you've watched, but because it is taking certain techniques that if you've watched a lot of anime, you're very familiar with, and it's taking them to their absolute zenith of like, this is as far as this can go to be as beautiful and effective as it can be.
Well, and this is a good preview for something we're going to talk about later this season, Sean, because we're later in this season doing Berserk, the 1997 anime, and that show also famously does this kind of thing. Kind of the Tezuka thing more than... because nothing quite does the Belladonna of Sadness thing. But Berserk, it was a sort of... They had a limited budget to do one of the most ambitious manga ever written, and so they decided, let's illustrate the biggest moments of... Kentaro Miura's art style through sort of these gorgeous stills, and then save our effort for places where we really need to show the movement. And we'll get there and we'll talk about it, because I think Berserk is one of the other peaks of limited animation as a true artistic technique, where the show does not in any way to me feel compromised. It feels very intentional. And of course that's the same thing with Belladonna of Sadness. If you were to watch Belladonna of Sadness and go, fucking cheaped out, where's all the animation? You would be the dumbest person alive, right? Because it's so clearly the intent of the movie is to have these gorgeous watercolors and these big tableaus and these images that look like medieval paintings, and you're really studying them, and you're studying them in conjunction with a very active sound layer, because that's one of the other keys to limited animation, is as the animation goes down, you have to work even harder on the sound design. And I think the Tezuka is good at that, and I think this show has incredible sound design, or this movie has incredible sound design and music to show you the voices, to have the songs, and to have that really dynamic interplay. And then, as you say, Sean, when it wants to come to life, like the moment that blew me away, I'm not even sure you would call it animation because it's something else, but it is when she effectively joins with the devil at the midpoint of the movie and they have their full consummation, is you go from the kind of stills to this rapid escalation of the watercolor art becoming more and more filled in, and just like the frames start going by really fast, and everything is like just unbelievably lush, and then it suddenly becomes oil paints really heavily applied onto paper, the way you would see in like a museum where you can see like the three-dimensionality of the painting, and it kind of explodes into that. And so there's also these expressive moments like that. Or the orgy, the way they draw that, which is this basically an extension of what Sugi Gizaburo did on 1001 Nights, where it is these twisting bodies, like you can't tell where one starts and one ends, and it's phalluses and it's like vaginal openings kind of all becoming one in the other, and it's this incredible like interplay of movement that's all in one, and that is the kind of thing that they're able to do with the detail that they're able to do it, because a lot of the other stuff is stills. Just stylistically, this movie is unlike anything else that's, I think, ever been made.
Yeah, and it is an incredible experience. And then that's all being done to tell a story that is so supported by that visual style, right? So it's like, you know, even to a much greater extent, but it's a little bit like with 1001 Night, where they had a great, like, sort of kind of story that matched the sort of aesthetic they were going for. Cleopatra, it is incredibly dissonant, and that movie kind of falls apart because of it. Here, it is just such a perfect union where you go to a very like classic kind of story mode where you're playing with, you know, the notion of Satan and what Satan means. It's like the most classical, obviously Western traditionally, and this is pulling from and inspired by Western sources, though, you know, through Western hegemony and its, you know, a certain cultural dominance in Japan post the war, it is obviously going to have resonance in Japan in different ways as well. But when you're just thinking about that notion of Satan and what it brings to humanity, and that dichotomy between Satan and God, between chaos and order, and how the system wants you to privilege what it tells you to privilege, which is God and order and law and those things that institute a hierarchy, which is what the Lord benefits from, then naturally the thing you really need to gravitate to is Satan. And I love the way the movie, you know, upends that sort of like structure you expect from society, and it, you know, playing into that tradition the way of like, you know, the thing that I always think of is Paradise Lost. The Paradise Lost I don't think is doing it intentionally, but the way in which Paradise Lost makes Satan the most compelling figure in that epic poem, and the one through which you see the roots of what humanity is. And if you privilege humanity as it exists and the brilliant things that humanity is, you really are privileging Satan, because what God asks for is something that is inhuman and is not human. And so I just think the way that this movie tells that story of this woman slowly realizing how destroyed and aberrant her world is, and how you cannot live in it, and how she must sort of like go outside the confines of that world in order to be herself and find power, and then the way that the system then tries to crush and destroy her for it. I just think it's like a really effective story that exists in this like dreamlike subconscious space that the watercolor style and the sort of like gaps in the imagery invites you to get into. And there's just so many incredible moments with that. One of my favorite in terms of just the like dialogue. There's not a lot of dialogue in this movie, but there's one line I just love so much, which is when she is having her intermingling with the devil at the middle of the movie, and he asks her, "What do you want to do?" And she says, "Something bad. I'll do anything as long as it's something bad." It's like, that's just such a fucking sick line. And of course, she doesn't do anything bad, because the great sin she commits in this movie, she fucking cures the Black Death for people. But that's something that is going to bother the church that is not capable of doing these great things, and thus will suppress someone who proves that they are better than they are. I just think that all of that stuff, the way in which she isn't evil, she isn't doing anything bad. All she is doing is embracing herself, her sexuality, and her power in the world. And of course, there's nothing that patriarchal hierarchy despises more than a woman who is powerful, and it must burn her at the stake for it. It's such a great representation of very, very classic themes, but very potent themes nonetheless.
Potent themes, obviously politically resonant. I think for wherever and whenever you're living in the world at this point. There is so much to say here. I mean, we're watching this in early 2025, and Yup.
Yep.
Just say that. But like, yeah. And I think also, you know, this movie, through all of that, deals very heavily with sexual assault.
Yeah.
And that is obviously a sticky subject to depict on film, to talk about on film, with the acknowledgement right here that I think is necessary that you and I are both cis guys who come at this from a different angle than I think women in the audience would. It feels to me like a very sensitive and like smart portrayal of this. It is not pulling its punches, like it is brutal in how it depicts this. It does not ever literally depict it in terms of like pictorial realism. I think it leans towards a series of images that I think are about, and I think this is why it feels smart and I think sensitive, even though it is brutal, is that the imagery of sexual assault, I think, is meant to display like why it feels violative, what is violent about it, rather than just showing it or getting off on it. Like, this is the least erotic of the three movies in many ways, because it is about, at least in the first half, the pain and the horror of this thing. It is not using sexual violence as a casual mode of titillation. I don't think it is pornographic in how it shows it. But I think, for instance, the way in the first scene where she is effectively gang raped by the Baron's court, which is a historical detail of things that these kind of feudal lords did, and it's horrible. They show her body and they have this motif of bleeding, because of course that would happen in this scenario, and the blood becomes this force that is invading her then. And they show this kind of like the sex scene or the sexual assault scene is of this like red formless void that is personified and is coming in and out of her violently. And I think it is harrowing to watch, but it also feels deeply serious in how it is trying to approach this idea of what a violation it is. And then as that evolves over the course of the movie with the devil character, how this woman has to then come to understand what sexuality is in a world where that is her starting point with it. Obviously, this is a big topic that could be the topic of this entire podcast episode, but I think the way it gets into that idea, it was definitely the thing. Knowing some of the plot of the movie before I watched it, I was kind of worried about how it would be handled, particularly after having seen the first two movies in the Animerama Trilogy. But I do think, like, you know, this isn't a movie I would spring on students, but it is a movie that, like, for a high enough level class, like a 4,000 level for undergrads or a graduate seminar, I do think with the proper introduction, I would feel comfortable showing and discussing. And I don't always think that even about great movies that deal with sexual assault. I think sometimes it's the wrong kind of thing, and you wouldn't want to give that to a discussion group of students. I do think this movie walks the walk artistically and ideologically in what it's saying and what it's doing in a way that not all movies do.
I agree. And I think a big part of it is one, it is valuing her subjective experience, right?
Yes.
So it's like, and that's part of the artistic representation of it, of everything we are seeing is a step outside of like a defined literal physical reality. It is this like psychological representation of things. And we are seeing this movie fundamentally from Jean's perspective and from her experiences. I think that's one thing that's very important. And the other thing is that, you know, it gets right this sense of that what happens to her is not a matter of sex, it's a matter of power and domination, right? It is a way for which this hierarchical system can put her in her place and keep her in that place and subdue her. And that is the thing that she is fighting against every step of the way. And this is like the most blatant, violent, oppressive version of it that happens to her at the beginning, especially when she has no power. And it happens senselessly and purposely from her perspective. But for the Lord and his men, it is just a way of subjugating the people below them and demonstrating the power and control that they have over anyone and everyone under their purview. And so in that way, it is both a criticism of that kind of dominant relationship, but it's also just a criticism of like the notion of that form of governance, of people having that kind of power over another, and what those people then are allowed to get away with. And of course, in a medieval or early modern historical context, that is extreme. But obviously, even in today's world, you can make so many equivalents with, like, when you think of the Me Too movement, these power structures that value specific men in specific industries, like in the movie industry, obviously, is where you got a lot of it, who, because of the level of authority that they are able to express over other people, and specifically over certain women, they're allowed to abuse and sexually assault these women and then cover it up because they can just threaten to destroy any number of people's careers along the way if they want to do it. And so that predatory dominant show of force in trying to maintain, preserve, and build up a hierarchy of power is what the movie, I think, is demonstrating. And it's showing her having to, like, suffering that experience and then having to find a way of how do you destroy that? How do you rot that hierarchy from the bottom and destroy it? And, that is obviously then when the French Revolution imagery and the image at the ending is telling you, here's how, like, in the future, these events can echo through time as change is made and as that system rots from underneath. But you also see in Jean's actions as a rebel, in her joining with Satan and then bringing a prosperity to the people under the Lord's power that the Lord could not bring. And then they, like, love and adore her for it, and so she must be destroyed for that love and adoration. Like, I just think that that's such a cool, powerful message that the movie is able to deliver in that way.
Well, and let's just rip the Band-Aid off and talk about contemporary resonances, Sean, because it's 2025 and we need to have these conversations. Because this movie got me thinking about this. In the United States of America, our president is an adjudicated rapist. He is a known serial sexual assaulter, and almost to the point of not even being something he denies or his followers deny. And if we are being perfectly honest with ourselves, that was not a thing that held him back politically. It is something that empowered him politically, because there's a whole class of men in this country, but also, women in proximity to power or who have, been instilled with a certain sense of what gender roles are, that is something that is a good thing about Donald Trump, is that he is someone who is in the proper place as a guy who enacts power through sexual violence. And this is, of course, connected to the major political success he has had in his career, which is the overthrow of Roe v. Wade and of women's bodily autonomy. And that is the biggest political shift in the era we are living in, is the end of a major constitutional right for a specific class of people in the United States. And that this whole fascist movement that he is at the head of is predicated in no small part on abusing and taking away the autonomy of women. And this is a story about, the Belladonna of Sadness movie is a story about this kind of system, where she is a woman who has her body taken from her, who has her bodily autonomy taken from her, who is, raped by her lord, who is abandoned by a husband who is also abused by this system. And I think that's actually one of the most interesting things this movie does, is this specific empathy it has for the husband character, I think is fascinating. But what it shows you is, and I think that the style of the movie is so inseparable from this theme, is it is a movie about how the order she exists in is aberrant. It is wrong. It is violent. It is evil. It is evil in a way that is disgusting, that once the scales fall from your eyes and you're able to see it not as normal, but as aberrant, but as evil, it makes you want to fucking throw up. And at that point, the logical thing is, let's embrace the fucking devil. And you can read that however you want. I think there's the specific religious role reading you gave for us, Sean, that I think is very smart, of the way it, contrasts the order of God versus the order of Satan. And of course, this ties into the whole history of, tales of witchcraft and Satanism. But also, I think just in a political sense, the idea that if the dominant order is this fucked, then what you turn to is not engaging with that order, but in some way a reversal of it, right? And that is what she is able to create when she becomes this witch who is able to heal the sick, who is able to empower citizens and herself sexually. And the moment that ties the movie together for me is when they finally decide, okay, we can't just fight the influence of this witch. We're going to try to bring her into court. And they offer her the things that this political order would be able to offer. Yes. We're going to give you 100 acres of land. We're going to give you nobility, all of this stuff. And they finally well, what the fuck do you want? And she says, I want everything. I want the world. I want you to give me the world. And that is when he's finally like, no, 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 burn the witch. And it is this statement of, I want a higher aspiration than you can even imagine, you little rapist prick up here in your castle. And I think there is such a powerful mic drop quality to that, of even if you're going to burn me, I'm not going to sand down what is fucking owed. Like, it is righteous. And this is a movie made in 1973 in Japan, and I just feel like it is so powerfully resonant to 2025 America, where we're sitting recording this. It blows my mind.
Yeah, because, I mean, the thing that he offers her is still subjugation to authority and to order, right? Like, it's like the whole point of what Jean is doing is showing that, like, the rule of law is wrong in the world in which she lives, right? And you equate, like, the law with what is good, and the law and what is good with what is godly, right? And that is like the way that society wants you to believe, until you associate these things with, well, that's what, you know, the police do, and the police enforce the law, and so they are the quote unquote good guys, and you go to church and you worship God and you do what God tells you because God is the good guy, and if you do those things then you'll go to heaven, and so on and so forth, right? Meanwhile, you're looking at, you know, oh, well, you know, you're this priest has sexually assaulted, you know, children in this community. Oh, and the police are shooting black people in the streets, you know, and whatever, for, you know, and there's sexual assault and rape happening, and all these other things are just being enforced and protected and defended and accelerated by these quote unquote good things, by the law, by God, by the system. Well, then what you have, your recourse then is bad, is Satan, right? So when she says, like, I want to do something bad, I will do anything if it is bad, is because what that world has defined as good is evil. And what she must embrace is what that world would define as bad, because that is what is actually, with like a capital G, is truly the good. And so anything that the Lord can offer her only exists within a system where good and evil are topsy-turvy. And so the only thing that she can say is, I want the world. Like, I want to give me everything, because everything, the world, exists outside your system. It is bigger. It is more than what that system is. And I can then define my life on my own terms, not on the terms that you try to give me. Even if that means she would have wealth and she would have tremendous power and influence, which she would if she had accepted his deal. It would be wealth and influence within a corrupt and broken system.
Yeah. I mean, there's an actual revolutionary zeal to this movie's politics and the way it presents things. Like, to a degree that when we talk about it, makes me a little viscerally uncomfortable to talk about, right? Because there's and that's what actual revolutionary politics should make you feel, I think, right? And that is, and again, I think it's very rare to see movies that are truly able to break out of a dominant order enough to convey a sense of revolutionary politics. And I think one of the things that unites a lot of movies that do this is they have to be in some way avant-garde. Yeah. They have to reject certain codes of narrative form or visual form in order to do that. And that doesn't mean they have to be avant-garde like this, where like visually it's like completely weird. It can be as simple as something like the Battle of Algiers, or the African film Sambizanga, these movies that are sort of neo-realist inspired in how they are stories, but they have the sort of rough visual quality of a documentary, or they aren't concerned with being outwardly beautiful and composed, and they're able to instill a revolutionary zeal through just kind of shooting what is there and arranging the mise-en-scène based on what is, you know, extant in the world and these kinds of things. Because that is a form of avant-garde art too, lest we forget and we think it's just all the weird stuff with paint, which sometimes it is, and I love it. This is a weird movie with paint. But like there's something about any kind of revolutionary political project in art where the art itself has to be a little revolutionary, and that is 100% what Belladonna of Sadness is doing to just tremendous effect. Yeah,
because, you know, the structures of like narrative order and things like that are created by and privileged by a propagandistic system. I mean, that's what it's designed to be. That's what it has always been designed to be. You know, like we were talking about mythology with 1001 Nights. I mean, mythology is propaganda. It is like meant to teach you things about society. Some of those things can be relatively simple, like Why does the sun go up in the morning and go down at night? Oh, it's because there's Helios and he's got his chariot and they go across the sand, it's the whole thing. Or it can be something that's much more like the Iliad, which is about instilling, like, we are Greek. This is our racial and cultural identity, and we have fought and defeated a great and potent other, which are the Trojans, and that is what unites us as a people. And there's a jingoistic fundamental quality to the Iliad, right? So it's like so much of storytelling in a conventional sense is designed to create and reinforce that kind of order that the Lord in the movie represents. So by necessity, you must invoke the avant-garde. And I do think while it doesn't necessarily have to be stylistically avant-garde in the, like, it's a weird movie with paint way, the weird movie with paint quality goes hand in hand with that. Like, I think it's a space that you kind of, it makes sense that an artist would feel the need or the compulsion to intrude into that kind of space because it is synergistic with the more avant-garde narrative thrust of the film, that to express these ideas that are trying to break outside of the conventional structure of what is good and evil, that it is easier to express those things in ways that are unconventional.
100%. I also want to, while we're talking about the experimental qualities, I also do think it's worth saying structurally, I think this movie is very tight and very smart.
Yeah.
And it's one of the ways I would get into it if I were writing, like, academically about this film, is that you look, it's got this kind of repetitious structure, but in a repetition and change sort of way. And I think that actually kind of goes hand in hand with some of the rock opera qualities of it.
Yes.
But you will have a narrative sequence that will usually culminate in some kind of wrong being done to Jeanne, usually a sexual assault, sometimes a physical battery of her body. There's multiple things that happen to her. And that will be done usually through dialogue and narration and still images with maybe some light pans, but not a ton. And then that will go into one of their long tableaus that is a horizontal tracking shot, right to left, and goes across the screen. And you'll often have a musical interlude there, or you'll have a long stretch of narration explaining what happens. And that is when you will get kind of the fallout of that event and the next couple years of the story or something, and it'll be told that way. And then when that is done, you'll kind of go into the next narrative sequence that will culminate in kind of a downfall assault. And that repeats about 3 times until you get to the midpoint of the movie, where there is the rupture, where she consummates with the devil in the mountains, and then you have a sequence unlike anything else we have seen so far, with this kind of kaleidoscopic imagery, and it becomes the big, like, pop cultural explosion that results from the union of Jeanne and the devil. And then we have the kind of fade to black. It almost feels like, even though this is a short movie, there should be like an intermission there. It's why I would be fascinated to see whatever that live action thing they shot was and how it would function, because then the second half of the movie is very different. And the second half of the movie kind of inverts that structure to be Jeanne kind of getting one over on these people, and the long tableau tracking shots are basically the big orgiastic rites she participates in, and the way they show all these, different kinds of sexual imagery of sex organs. Or they have one of my favorite ones is the hands that are going back and forth that create like a vaginal opening, and that is the way they show that, is like through this space in the hands, and they do all of this stuff. And so the way it kind of alternates between predictable kinds of stylistic motifs, but in a way that kind of has a repetition and change structure that becomes unpredictable. I think it's a sharper film on that structural level than you might think, looking at how experimental the art is.
Yeah, and I definitely think it's something that comes to a certain extent from its, like, sort of that musical quality and that sort of concept album sort of element that you feel there, because that is so much what, like, a lot of those kinds of albums like Atami or The Wall feel like, where you get, there you get like literal motifs, right, that are repeating. And so you get like, here are some early motifs that repeat in the first part of the album, and then eventually you reach some sort of rupture point in the story that the character must now overcome, and then you get like a full transformation, usually with like very different motifs coming out the other side, with your like whatever your kind of big sort of like mic drop piece is, and then your character reaches enlightenment or whatever it is that your album is about. And so there is this like that sense of like the repetition, the motif, and that being built upon until it breaks and then evolves into something that's new, that feels so much like any of those concept rock albums of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, 100%. So, again, this is a movie that we could have, I think, devoted its own 3-hour podcast to. There's a lot to break down here. I think it is one of the great works of Japanese theater animation. It's truly kind of a humbling thing. It's the kind of movie that ended, and I just had to sit there in silence for a while, just kind of processing it. I will also say, where I found both 1001 Nights and Cleopatra hit or miss to different degrees, and they both tested my patience at different moments, I think this movie is riveting. I think it is a quick watch. It's not just literally that it is 86 minutes, but it is 86 riveting minutes, which is just one of the many ways it feels like it's kind of weird to group all these movies together. But at the same time, I do think there's something valuable in putting these three movies next to each other and seeing how they do come out of two sides of the same cultural coin. Again, going back to the beginning of this discussion, this all comes from a period of the dominant cinematic commercial order falling and new things coming in its place, the pink films, the Japanese new wave. And I think it is interesting that Yamamoto Eiichi walked that kind of whole span of what was going on in Japanese cinema in this little 4-year stretch with these three movies. And it's fascinating. I can't think of another director who quite did something like this. Maybe a Seijun Suzuki, but over a longer period of time, if that makes sense, you know? In part because he was banished from the industry for a long time and had to go fuck around on Lupin III. But, it's just a very unique set of movies, not just for Japanese animation, which is our domain, but I just think for film history in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a weird set of, odd ducks, you know? And it is... there is the sense of Belladonna of Sadness is both kind of feels like it exists outside of its previous two films, but in other ways it's like the apotheosis of those movies. It's like what I feels like the director kind of wanted to do, but for various reasons was not able to do with the production of those films. Then finally, when he's given his own reign, this is the thing that is born out of that. And yeah, it is definitely... It's a wild set of movies. I had a lot of fun over the past week, kind of going from one to the next. I watched 1001 Nights, and then a couple days later I did Cleopatra, then a couple days later I did Belladonna of Sadness. It was definitely an interesting way to sort of color my week watching these three films.
Hey, what did you do this week, Mr. Chapman? I'm just imagining your students asking me well, kids, let me tell you about Cleopatra, Queen of Sex.
Yeah, this is like the calculus I do in my head when I'm having conversations with my colleagues of
yeah.
what, and when they ask me so what did you do over the weekend? What degree of honest am I going to be? And I'm going to be I watched some movies. Yeah, it was fun. Or am I going to actually try to have a conversation? These ones don't go in the I'm actually going to tell you what I really did over the weekend. They're a bit too radical for a lot of the people I work with.
Yes. But I'm glad we got to have this 3-episode focus on Tezuka. I'm glad in this episode we got to narrow in on Yamamoto Eiichi because he is a fascinating figure who had a relatively short career. But if you look at his run because his directorial debut effectively is Tales of a Certain Street Corner, and if you can find that, you should look at it because it's fascinating. I don't know of any version that's subtitled, but it's mostly just music and animation, so you don't need it, so go look for it. And then you look at Belladonna of Sadness, there's a real arc there where I think that's the thing kind of that was his North Star coming back around to. And there is kind of a full circle quality. But I'm glad we got to talk about him. I'm glad we got to celebrate Sugi Gizaburo. We got to meet some really fun characters in this little 3-episode mini arc, Sean. But time moves on and so must we. So what are we talking about next time as we move away from Tezuka and his world?
Yes. Well, so far, Jonathan, are in our classic fashion, our grand tour, which is supposed to be just a bunch of one-offs where we just pick a bunch of random shows. We've done a 2-part on Dragon Ball GT and a 3-part on various Tezuka-related things. But finally, next week, we're getting a proper... This is actually kind of what we designed this season to be. We're getting a true one-off that has no connection to any other show in our grand tour. It is a show that I have picked that I'm very excited to rewatch because I saw it in probably 2012 or 2013, and I have not seen it since. But I loved it when I first saw it. I have just wanted to rewatch it, and I've used this season of Japanimation Station as an excuse to do that. Next time, we are watching Welcome to the NHK.
娘は りがち物語を紡ぐキャリアを選んで成功してした意地で何度もここのビルがモブできる